What is the longest military siege in all of history? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes alive and each video plunges you into the fate of those who shaped the world. Today, prepare to step through the veil of time and dive into a colossal confrontation where patience was a weapon and time a battlefield. On the island of Crete, between Venetian walls and Ottoman cannons, the longest siege in history took place, the Siege of Candia. There, everything is fire, stone, and determination. For 21 years, the Ottomans encircled the city, determined to wrest it from the hands of the Serenissima. Facing them, an exhausted but proud garrison, entrenched behind bastions carved out of the very will to survive. Naval battles, booby-trapped tunnels, explosions, betrayals. Every day, the city wavers without ever falling. Every month, it bleeds, resists, endures. And over the years, Candia becomes a hell of mud and ruins, an open grave where armies bury themselves slowly. Why was a city deemed worthy of 21 years of war? But before setting off on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and have a nice trip. In the mid-17th century, Europe was undergoing a period of profound upheaval, and the year 1640 embodied the approach of a major change. For more than 2 decades, the continent had been shaken by the 30 Years' War, a complex conflict opposing several European powers over religious, political, and dynastic issues. The negotiations toward the Treaty of Westphalia, underway for some time, were slowly progressing toward a resolution that might redraw the borders and balance of power in northern Europe. The belligerents, weary of the destruction caused by long campaigns, began to consider an agreement to end the bloodshed. In this context, diplomacy was active, and various delegations were preparing to seal one of the most decisive treaties in European history. In the Holy Roman Empire, clashes had multiplied since 1618, the date marking the start of the Protestant uprising in Bohemia against the Catholic Habsburgs. The Swedish armies, originally led by King Gustavus Adolphus, intervened to support the Protestant princes, imposing spectacular victories, notably at Breitenfeld in 1631. France, effectively led by Cardinal Richelieu and King Louis X, also took part in the conflict, taking advantage of the weakening of the Habsburgs. In this troubled panorama, minor powers sought to preserve their possessions, while the roles of the great monarchies evolved along the lines of alliances. Amidst these ruins, civilian populations suffered from shortages and epidemics, hoping for the imminent end of hostilities. England, on the other hand, was also in a phase of decisive political transformation. Since the accession of King Charles III, tensions between the monarchy and Parliament had continued to grow, culminating in what is now called the English Revolution, or English Civil War. In 1640, the king had to recall the Parliament he had previously dissolved, hoping to raise funds for his military operations in Scotland. However, Parliament used this opportunity to impose a series of institutional reforms, increasingly openly challenging royal authority. The principles of popular sovereignty and religious freedom were fiercely debated, pushing England into a new phase of its history, whose outcome was still uncertain. In southern Europe, Portugal regained its independence after 60 years of dynastic union with Spain. On December 1st, 1640, the Duke of Braganza accepted the Portuguese crown as John IV, thus breaking the domination of the Spanish Habsburgs over the country. This geopolitical shift was crucial, redrawing the map of the Iberian Peninsula and reviving Portugal's maritime ambitions, which sought to reaffirm its presence in global trade. Portuguese colonial expeditions then faced sharper competition from emerging powers like England and especially the Dutch Republic, also known as the United Provinces, dominating trade and navigation networks in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. The Dutch Republic, in effect independent since the end of the 16th century, emerged as a new leading maritime power. Their merchant fleet sailed the seas of the globe, bringing spices, porcelains, silks, and other exotic products back to the ports of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, or Middelburg. For the Dutch, the creation of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, in 1602, and then the Dutch West India Company, WIC, in 1621, paved the way for lucrative trade monopolies. At the dawn of the 1640s, the Dutch Republic consolidated its republican model and maintained an intense rivalry with Spain, from whom they obtained official recognition of independence in 1648. However, the conflict was not only military or political, it also involved the mastery of sea routes, a major issue in European enrichment. To the east, the Ottoman Empire still occupied a dominant power position, inherited from successive expansions since the reign of Suleiman III, known as the Magnificent, who died in 1566. From Constantinople, today Istanbul, the Sultan controlled a vast area stretching from the Balkans to Anatolia, including the Near East and North Africa. In the Arab provinces, administered by governors appointed by the Sublime Porte, Sunni Islam had become dominant, while Christian and Jewish minorities retained their rights under protection in exchange for paying specific taxes. Beyond the Adriatic Sea, Ottoman threat or influence weighed on the republics and principalities bordering the Mediterranean, which had to regularly negotiate or ally to maintain their positions. Mastery of the Mediterranean remained a strategic issue for the Ottoman Empire, which maintained an impressive fleet to secure its coastal possessions and control trade. The Barbary corsairs, based in Algiers, Tunis, or Tripoli, operated with the Sultan's approval, conducting raids as far as the coasts of the Iberian Peninsula or Italy. In Constantinople, the Sultan's power and his viziers relied on a subtle balance between the elite Janissary corps, the central administration, and the provincial beys. In the mid-17th century, the Ottoman dynasty had to contend with internal revolts, border wars against Safavid Persia, and ambitions of expansion towards Central Europe, where the Habsburg threat and the resistance of certain strongholds influenced strategic decisions. Beyond the Atlantic Ocean, the power map was also changing rapidly. Spain and Portugal had long dominated the colonies of Latin America and Asia, but the rise of England and the Dutch Republic gradually rebalanced the power dynamics. Moreover, France timidly attempted to create its own colonies in America, despite being primarily engaged in continental conflicts. African trading posts became places of exchange where gold, spices, and slaves were traded, arousing the envy of all powers for whom servile labor was indispensable for exploiting the plantations of the New World. In 1640, new trade flows initiated a global change, revealing that the period was conducive to great discoveries, maritime alliances, and future naval confrontations. China, then under the Ming dynasty since the 14th century, faced significant internal turmoil that would lead to a historical shift. The 1630s and 1640s were marked by peasant rebellions, the proliferation of warlords, and the imperial court's inability to curb famines and natural disasters. Emperor Chongzhen, the last Ming sovereign, was confronted by both internal pressure from rebellious factions and the progressive threat of the Manchus, a people from the region northeast of the Great Wall. The Manchus, under leaders like Nurhaci and his successor Hongtaiji, and later Emperor Shunji, organized themselves into formidable banners and effective military system. They prepared to cross the borders to seize power in Beijing. The Ming-Qing transition was thus underway, and it would be completed in 1644, when Manchu forces entered the capital, establishing the Qing dynasty in power until 1912. Under the reign of Shah Jahan, who ascends to the imperial throne in 1628, the Mughal power in India reaches a golden age, establishing himself as one of the most extravagant rulers in history. A disciple of architecture and a great art enthusiast, he commissioned the legendary Taj Mahal in Agra, a mausoleum dedicated to his late wife, Mumtaz Mahal. The Mughals control a considerable territory, extending from the Indus Valley to Bengal, and from the Deccan Plateau to the foothills of the Himalayas. Thanks to a rigorous administration and the prosperity of the spice, textile, and precious stone trades, their empire enjoys relative stability. Nevertheless, costly military campaigns and sporadic revolts continue to weigh on royal finances, while in the southern peninsula, some Hindu kingdoms still resist Mughal hegemony. On battlefields around the world, military innovations are multiplying, profoundly altering the way war is conducted. Low-mount artillery, derived from improvements to medieval cannons, offers greater stability and increased firepower. Armies study and adopt technical improvements from armament workshops, where cannon founders perfect the casting of bronze and iron. Moreover, the design of Italian-style bastion fortifications, popularized since the Renaissance, becomes indispensable for anyone wanting to effectively defend their borders. Military engineers, inspired by masters like Michelangelo Buonarroti or Giuliano da Sangallo, adapt bastions to cannons, multiplying firing angles and reinforcing defensive works against enemy projectiles. Princes and republics invest considerable sums to modernize their infrastructures, erect citadels, and dig moats. The confrontation between oar-driven galleys and sail-powered ships continues in the Mediterranean and Atlantic waters. The galleys, used since antiquity, are equipped with a shallow draft and greater maneuverability in coastal areas. Their crews, often consisting of convicts or prisoners of war, must row over long distances, limiting their range. In contrast, the improved sail vessels, sometimes called galleons or ships of the line, carry more cannons and fewer rowers, relying on wind power for movement. Maritime powers gradually adopt these large sailing ships, capable of crossing oceans, operating on the high seas, and engaging in artillery duels at longer ranges. At the beginning of the 13th century, the political and territorial balance of the Eastern Mediterranean is profoundly disrupted by the events of the Fourth Crusade. Officially launched to reconquer Jerusalem, this misdirected expedition attacks Constantinople, the prestigious capital of the Byzantine Empire. In 1204, the fall of the imperial city leads to a division of Byzantine lands in favor of Latin powers, including Venice, which conquers several strategic islands. Among these, Crete occupies a crucial position, as it is located at the heart of maritime routes, linking Western Europe, the Near East, and the Asian trade centers. As soon as it gains control over this island with its multiple riches, the Serenissima Republic establishes a rectorial administration system, a form of local government led by Venetian representatives who take the title of rectors or governors. This arrangement, already practiced in Cyprus or other Latin dependencies, aims to maintain a balance between Venice's commercial interests and the management of the local populations, who are mostly Greek. Venice soon renames the island's capital to Candia, now Heraklion. It is a vital port within the trade routes that carry spices, silk, and other oriental products to Europe. Galleys, carracks, and merchant ships regularly call there, benefiting from well-stocked warehouses and markets. In return, Crete exports significant quantities of wheat, wine, olive oil, and cheese, products essential to the economic survival of the Maritime Republic. The Serenissima quickly considers this territory not only as a major commercial hub, but also as an essential grain source, especially during times of famine in the lagoon. The warehouses of Candia fill up with shipments bound for Venice, giving the island a privileged status among Venetian possessions. The acquisition of Crete, however, coincides with a period of intense rivalries in the Mediterranean. The end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era see several powers succeeding one another in the quest for naval and territorial supremacy. The crowns of France and Castile aspired, from the 13th and 14th centuries, to extend their influence over crucial areas like Cyprus or Rhodes. The Knights Hospitaller, established in Rhodes, and the Genoese and Chios also posed challenges for Venice, each seeking to secure control over the trade routes to the Levant. For a time, Aragon became a major player in the Western Mediterranean, seeking to form alliances or absorb strategic territories. Later, the rise of the Ottoman Empire radically altered the regional balance. Already solid in Anatolian lands in the Balkans, the Sublime Porte began to view the sea as an imperative arena. Its dynamic expansion gradually clashed with Venetian interests in the Aegean archipelago. The successive wars over the possession of Cyprus, Rhodes, or Chios speak to the bitterness of this rivalry, and Venice sometimes had to yield ground in the face of the long advance of the Ottomans. To secure Crete and protect it from these competitors, the Republic of Venice invested in an extensive network of bastioned fortresses covering the island's key points. The defensive system included several works: Lasud, Grambusa, Rethymnon, and, of course, Candia itself. The Venetian engineers adapted, over time, the Italian style of fortification, made famous by many military architects of the Italian peninsula. Among them stands out Michel Sanmicheli, renowned for his rational plans and low-angled bastions, better suited to modern artillery. The crenellated ramparts of earlier periods gave way to polygonal works, flanked by bastions, capable of mutually covering their blind spots. This allowed them to withstand assaults from many attackers, whether they be pirates, corsairs, or regular armies. Venice understood that Crete, positioned at the crossroads of trade routes, needed to withstand long sieges. The defensive doctrine thus emphasized the multiplication of fortified points and the constant improvement of cannons, bombards, and munitions. The fortresses of Lasud and Grambusa, located respectively in Ceuta Bay and on a rocky islet northwest of Crete, completed the system erected around Rethymnon and Candia. Lasud protected a natural enclave where the Venetian fleet could anchor safely. As for Grambusa, its insular position made any surprise attack difficult. It quickly became a critical stop for controlling the western access to the island. The citadels were also designed to resist not only traditional siege weapons, but also incendiary shells and larger caliber cannonballs. The use of wide moats, buttresses, and stone claddings helped limit the destructive effect of repeated bombardments. All this defensive architecture, painstakingly developed, reflected the ingenuity of late Renaissance Venetian experts, who skillfully combined the aesthetic of Italian fortifications with the tactical demands of the terrain. In parallel, permanent garrisons and well-stocked arsenals maintained the fighting capability of each advanced post. Despite these military precautions, Venetian Crete was far from uniform on a social and cultural level. The island's population was divided into several layers, whose respective statuses led to friction. At the top were the Venetian nobles, or nobili, appointed by the metropolis to administer the island and derive income from it. The Doge of Venice thus delegated hereditary or temporary positions to certain patrician families who settled in the main Cretan cities. These nobles forged local alliances, often owned fertile agricultural land, negotiated contracts with merchants, and collected various taxes. Beneath this Venetian elite, there were the Greek Orthodox archontes, stemming from the old Byzantine aristocracy, or influential families who had adapted to the new regime. Many of them maintained their lands and earned income from agricultural productions. Some Greek archontes even managed to play a diplomatic role by serving as intermediaries between the Venetian authorities and the peasant masses. The Orthodox religion remained dominant among the native population, although Venetian Catholicism established itself in some cities. Below this privileged class, a large portion of the local population bears the burden of chores and taxes. Among them are the Cretan serfs, compelled to contribute their labor to the exploitation of lands and the harvesting of various agricultural goods. Regularly, they must settle dues in kind or pay various taxes, fueling persistent tensions. The Cretan hills, renowned for their olive groves and vineyards, demand a large workforce, and the profitability of crops remains a major issue. In the sometimes harsh conditions of the island, due to droughts or epidemics, the Venetian tax is sometimes perceived as oppressive and unjust. Peasant uprisings, though rarely successful, mark a silent anger that surfaces when the harvests fail, or when Venetian sergeants-at-arms use violence to suppress any hint of insubordination. On several occasions, the Republic dispatches legates to the area to pacify the spirits. These diplomatic representations seek to maintain the cohesion of the island, whose loss would deal a fatal blow to Venetian maritime expansion. Over the decades, Venice watches over its investment, aiming chiefly to make it profitable. Candia, the main port city, develops as a commercial focus. Its docks come alive each morning with a parade of carts pulled by mules, loaded with sacks of wheat, barrels of oil, and boxes of dried fruit. Latin, Hellenic, and Levantine merchants throng the warehouses to negotiate tariffs and export taxes. A considerable portion of the profits made on the island returns to the Serenissima, which needs it to finance its own military campaigns and ensure the prosperity of its merchant fleet. The revenues from Crete also contribute to the maintenance of the numerous galleys that, throughout the year, navigate the Adriatic transporting goods, soldiers, and officials. The Venetian authorities are busy modernizing the port facilities. They enlarge certain docks, set up dry docks for ship repairs, and build depots to store goods. This strengthening of infrastructure is accompanied by new commercial regulations, theoretically aimed at encouraging trade, but which can be burdensome for local merchants. Internal tensions are not the only difficulties Venice faces. The well-established French-Castilian competition is compounded by other challenges. The kings of Aragon, since the conquest of Majorca and Valencia, strive to secure bases in the western Mediterranean and seek to penetrate increasingly towards the east. Rivalries with Genoa, another Italian merchant city, regularly fuel conflicts whose main stake is the control of trade flows. Meanwhile, the diminished Byzantine Empire is no longer able to effectively counter the Latin advances until the Ottoman Empire, successor to the Seljuks in Anatolia, becomes the new great power in expansion. Starting from the mid-14th century, the Ottomans gradually seize Byzantine, Bulgarian, and Serbian territories and invest in some Aegean islands. Their fleet, although less prestigious than those of Venice or Genoa, grows as Ottoman power asserts itself. In this pivotal period, Venice tries to maintain its grip on Crete by further fortifying the island and ensuring its defense against any incursions. However, Ottoman pressure intensifies as the Sultanate gains confidence and resources. The Venetian lords of Crete must deal with this complex situation. They sometimes engage in diplomatic negotiations with Aragonese or Angevin representatives and seek support at the papal courts of Avignon or Rome in the hope of further legitimizing their possessions. The papal authority, eager to maintain Latin Christianity at the gates of the Orient, does not hesitate to support Venice with bulls confirming its right over the island. The Venetian authorities also used to their advantage the idea of a Latin faith bastion against threats from Asia Minor. This argument has the effect of temporarily appeasing internal criticisms of the oppressive tax system. As time passes, the social structure of Venetian Crete becomes more crystallized, with the nobles and archons maintaining their dominant position, while the common folk, the majority, endure the daily reality of taxes and labor duties. In the 16th century, the Mediterranean world went through new transformations. The Spaniards, heirs of the fusion between Castile and Aragon, embarked on expeditions to America and gradually shifted the heart of their empire towards the Atlantic. France somewhat neglected the eastern Mediterranean in favor of wars on its soil and in northern Italy, although crusade projects instigated by different kings sporadically persisted. As for Genoa, it strengthened its alliance with Spain and limited its expansionist ambitions in the Levant, preferring to focus on closer banking and commercial operations. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire achieved formidable naval power, stimulated by the capture of Constantinople in 1453 and the military successes of sultans like Selim I and Suleiman the Magnificent. The Ottomans even reached Algeria and Tunisia, controlled a large part of the Mediterranean coastline, and launched raids that threatened Venetian positions. Although Venice regularly signed truces or costly treaties to maintain its right to trade, military tensions persisted. Meanwhile, in Crete, the urban landscape was still being transformed under the guidance of Venetian engineers. In Candia, the city walls were reinforced, and new bastion systems were built to adapt the defense to the developments in artillery. In Rethymno, the engineers continued the work of Michel Saint-Micheli, expanding the fortress and digging wider moats. To ensure the transport of stones, wood, and metal, the Venetian administration regularly imposed additional taxes on Cretan families. The population, forced to contribute financially and physically to the construction of these structures, expressed their exasperation. Social tensions sometimes erupted in the form of acts of sabotage or the flight of serfs to more remote mountain villages, less accessible to the rector's authority. Local authorities attempted to suppress these protests by resorting to Venetian militias or contingents of Greek archons who, to preserve their privileges, endeavored to maintain order. However, the fear of a future Ottoman invasion also encouraged the people to support, sometimes reluctantly, the fortification projects meant to guarantee long-term security. The diversity of the population in Crete was reflected in religious festivals and civil architecture. Latin cathedrals stood alongside Byzantine churches, modeled on the Orthodox style. The rural regions were dotted with small chapels, with delicately painted icons, often the work of local artisans who perpetuated the post-Byzantine artistic tradition while assimilating some elements of Venetian culture. These cultural interactions were also reflected in the spoken language. A Cretan dialect mixed with Italianisms and Venetian expressions became common in some urban areas. The bilingual local elites took advantage of this blend to facilitate commerce and administrative dealings. Mixed marriages, although rare, sometimes occurred between Venetian nobles and Greek archons, creating an additional bond between the two ruling communities. The serfs, on the other hand, remained partly inclined to their Greek tradition and perceived the Venetian presence as a foreign authority, despite occasional marriages and reciprocal cultural influences. Throughout the 16th century and into the early 17th, Venice maintained its control of Crete against the Ottomans by multiplying negotiations and treaties, but also by preparing the island for a potential confrontation. The fortresses occupied a crucial defensive position geographically, since Crete was at the crossroads of maritime routes from Constantinople to the Italian coasts. The Venetians also ensured the maintenance of a formidable fleet, capable of intercepting any Ottoman attempt at a massive landing. From time to time, skirmishes erupted between Ottoman corsairs and Venetian galleys, particularly around the Aegean islands. Smuggling and piracy, practiced by certain Cretan factions, further complicated the situation. Greek or Venetian sailors engaged in illicit trafficking, fueling a very active black market in the eastern Mediterranean. The rectoral governors had to juggle between the need to punish these outlaws and the island's urgent needs, as at times, the unofficial commerce provided resources better distributed than the official channels. Over nearly 400 years, Crete became one of the most important colonies of the Republic of Venice. Its agricultural contributions, combined with its role as a compulsory stopover on the spice route and other goods from the Levant, consolidated the wealth of the Serenissima, which, in turn, sought to maintain internal peace by occasionally granting temporary tax relief or organizing distributions of wheat at reduced prices during the most severe famines. The central administration was primarily concerned that public discontent might threaten the island's stability at a time when rivalry with the Ottoman Empire was reaching its peak. It should not be forgotten that, symbolically, Crete held a special place in the Venetian imagination. Its mention evoked images of wealth and splendor, imposing domineering bastions, and tireless courage in the face of adversity. It was also on this island that a distinctive artistic style flourished, a mix of Greek traditions, Venetian contributions, and influences from various horizons. The Cretan school of painting, which bloomed under Latin domination, would later attest to this cultural ferment unique to Crete in the 16th and 17th centuries. At the turn of the 17th century, geopolitical tensions in the Mediterranean heightened. With European powers shifting towards transoceanic trade and the colonization of the New World, Venice gradually lost the economic edge it once enjoyed. The Netherlands, England, and even France were beginning to turn to the open seas, leaving the Republic to face the Sublime Porte almost alone for control over the eastern maritime passages. Political storms in Constantinople, the ongoing modernization of the Ottoman army and navy, as well as the Sultan's desire to end Venetian presence in the Mediterranean, formed a threatening constellation of circumstances for Crete. Despite its network of fortifications, the island found itself increasingly isolated in the event of a large-scale war. The Venetian garrisons, often comprised of professional soldiers recruited from the Balkans or Italy, proved costly to maintain, as did the naval expeditions necessary to deter the enemy. The archives of the time report that the nobili of Candia regularly sent alarming missives to the Senate of Venice, demanding more subsidies to strengthen the bastions and supply the population with food and weapons. Western missionaries and scholars passing through Crete described a palpable tension, fueled by the certainty that the Ottoman Empire, buoyed by its successes in the Aegean and elsewhere, would eventually deliver a decisive blow to the Venetian hold. High-ranking officials discussed strategies, launching a preemptive attack against the Ottoman bases in Anatolia, strengthening the alliance with other Christian powers, or even attempting to buy peace in exchange for heavy tributes. The coffers of the Serenissima, however, already strained by the defense of Cyprus in previous decades, struggled to keep up. Doges came and went, each with their own recovery plan, yet facing the reality of a Europe where religious and dynastic conflicts left little room for a grand united crusade against the Ottomans. Meanwhile, the Cretan population continued living, sometimes heavily taxed, relying on the harvests of wheat and olives. The wealthy classes still profited from exports, while serfs endured exhausting labor in the fields. Economic disparities widened, and large landowners, whether Venetian or Greek, were soon accused of abusing their power in an already unstable context. Acts of brigandage became more frequent in the hinterlands, and certain families retreated into fortified villages. The roads connecting Candia to Rethymnon or Ceuta were subject to security expeditions organized by governors, aware of the necessity to protect the free movement of goods and troops. In this increasingly tense atmosphere, artillery and military architecture are experiencing new advances. Engineers are monitoring technical progress made by both Western countries and the Ottomans. Traveling experts, often from Italy, offer their services to different princes or pashas, which accelerates the spread of know-how. San Michele himself, before his death, had already anticipated changes concerning the angle and thickness of ramparts, the placement of bastions, and the improvement of the curtains connecting these bastions. The arsenals of Candia strive to stockpile powder, lead, and cannonballs in large quantities, anticipating the day when they would need to repel a major siege. Local workshops, composed of blacksmiths and carpenters, produce lighter artillery pieces, adapted to the ramparts and mobile carriages designed to be moved quickly when needed. On the eve of 1645, as tensions peak between Venice and the Ottoman Empire, Crete appears as a well-guarded jewel, but threatened by the ambitions of a burgeoning empire. Venetian diplomats multiply alarming missives, the island's governors organize inspections of their defensive systems, and the population holds its breath, aware that the entire Mediterranean basin is on the brink of profound upheaval. Candia remains the keystone of the Venetian colonial edifice, essential to the prosperity of the Serenissima and symbolic of its resilience. Rethymno, Ceuta, and Gramvusa embody strategic positions capable of slowing down the offensive of any enemy fleet. But the military and political context is rapidly changing, testing this vast network of rectorial colonies and this mixed population subjected to persistent tensions. The protagonists of this story, whether Venetian patricians, Orthodox archons, or simple Cretan peasants, remain suspended by the evolving situation. The olive and vine fields, the grain warehouses, the bastioned ramparts, and the social mosaic that characterize Venetian Crete will soon find themselves at the heart of a major conflict that will disrupt the Mediterranean balance. When the Knights of the Order of Malta captured in 1644 an Ottoman caravan near Alexandria, the incident initially seemed to be just another audacious raid in their traditional harassment operations. However, this act has far deeper resonance. The Sublime Porte is convinced that the Republic of Venice, the owner of Crete and maritime rival of the Ottoman Empire, supports or encourages these knights. It is Ibrahim III, the reigning sultan, who first takes offense at the situation, denouncing the presumed complicity of Venice before the dignitaries gathered in his palace in Constantinople. The Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, an influential advisor determined to ensure Ottoman dominance over the Aegean Sea, then seized the opportunity to launch a large-scale operation to take Crete to control the sea routes and humiliate the Serenissima. For an international audience unfamiliar with these stakes, it's important to know that Crete, under Venetian administration, has always played a strategic commercial role, linking the east and the west while housing fortresses renowned for their modern Italian architecture. This island formed a vital bulwark against the Ottoman advance in the eastern Mediterranean. Now, Crete has long held a central place in the rivalry between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. To understand the Ottoman reaction in 1645, it is crucial to grasp that the Knights of Malta do not act in a vacuum. They know that any action against the Sublime Porte can weaken the common enemy and bolster the influence of Christian powers in the Mediterranean. Ibrahim III, supported by Kara Mustafa, openly accuses Venice of collusion, believing that the Serenissima seeks to destabilize Ottoman trade exchanges. In Constantinople, ulama and high-ranking military officials support the idea that a vigorous, possibly punitive response must be made. For them, controlling Crete has a clear strategic significance. Possessing this vast maritime territory equates to ruling over the route connecting present-day Turkey to the Balkans and North Africa. War becomes imminent when Ibrahim I approves the invasion plan, mobilizing a substantial armada and ground troops. Preparations focus on the arsenals of Anatolia and the Peloponnese, from which galleys, galleots, and ships armed with cannons are ready to support the landing. Everything then converges towards the imminent attack on the island. The 1645 campaign begins under favorable auspices for the Ottoman Empire. In the spring, the fleet sets in motion, gathering its contingents from the ports of Smyrna and Gallipoli. However, Venetian spies report several possible routes, leaving some uncertainty about the final target. Some expect a diversion maneuver towards Cyprus or Rhodes, but very soon, the Ottoman galleys point their bows towards Crete. The city of Chania is chosen as the first target because of its strategic importance and the quality of its bastioned fortifications. Despite the alert given by the local garrisons, the attackers, superior in number, flood the walls and moats of the city. The defenders, supported by Venetian bombards, resist as best they can. Yet, after several days of fierce combat, the garrison retreats. Chania falls into the hands of Ibrahim III, marking a resounding victory for the Ottoman camp. As soon as the city is captured, the Ottoman administration works to consolidate its gains, fortifying key points to prevent any Venetian counteroffensive. This initial success confirms the Sultan's determination. In the wake of this capture, the next target becomes Rethymno, another stronghold on the island, which the Venetians sometimes call Rettimo. Located in the center of the northern coast, this city benefits from solid bastion defenses, a disciplined garrison, and a population ready to support the war effort. However, the reinforcements promised by Venice arrive sporadically, hindered by naval hazards and Ottoman maneuvers. The attackers methodically progress, digging trenches, establishing their batteries of heavy artillery, and multiplying assaults against the ramparts. The Venetians strive to set up counter batteries and dig countermine galleries, hoping to sabotage the enemy tunnels. After weeks of intense fighting, Rethymno eventually yields to the Ottomans, who, after Chania, succeed in establishing a deeper foothold on the island. In response, the Venetian Senate demands its chief admiral attempt a blockade of the Dardanelles, hoping to cut off reinforcement routes to the empire. The initial naval battles do not, however, bring the decisive victory expected, and the two fleets often part after indecisive skirmishes, leaving Crete under strong Ottoman pressure. Morale remains fragile. While Venice attempts to mobilize its resources, Candia, the Cretan capital, organizes to face what now appears inevitable. a large-scale siege. The local authorities reinforce the ramparts, inspect the powder reserves, and establish guard tours. It is estimated that more than 80,000 barrels of powder are stored in various warehouses scattered under the city. This impressive amount illustrates both the Venetians' meticulous preparation and the deep fear of a massive offensive. Engineers specialized in the art of bastion fortification oversee the work, while the governor, named Generale di Candia, coordinates the enlistment of volunteer soldiers. Artisans work day and night crafting weapons, while blacksmiths maintain cannons and mortars. The residents, aware of the urgency, lend a hand by digging ditches or transporting materials and munitions. Each bastion is equipped with underground galleries, intended for countermining, the subtle art of blocking enemy tunnels. In the background, the fear of a devastating assault looms, and everyone dreads the moment when the Ottoman army will strike at the gates of Candia. Tension mounts. In this context, the initial incident caused by the Knights of Malta appears less like an isolated episode, and more like the spark igniting a much larger conflagration. The Venetian squadrons, sent to intercept Ottoman convoys, encounter fierce resistance. A modernized Ottoman navy relies on robust ships and novel tactics. Several battles, anxiously monitored by the whole of Europe, unfold at the entrance of the Dardanelles. Yet, while Venice hopes to break the Ottoman momentum by controlling this passage, it faces the ingenuity of Turkish captains and the strength of their coastal fortresses. Meanwhile, diplomatic tensions remain high. Sublime Porte demands reparations and official apologies, while the Serenissima denies any complicity with the Knights of Malta. This situation carries the seeds of a major conflict, as the Horizon-Bradensa War threatens to engulf international trade, potentially involving England, the Dutch Republic, or even France, all interested in the stability of the spice route. For now, the negotiations are stagnant, and the Cretan confrontation polarizes around Candia, the future stage of decisive confrontations. Each side watches the other, ready to strike hard. True to its reputation as a heavily fortified city, Candia sees an influx of refugees from the surrounding countryside. These families, fleeing the Ottoman advance, seek protection behind the massive bastioned curtains encircling the city. The ramparts, designed by Italian engineers even before hostilities began, incorporate triangular bastions to counter enemy artillery. Indeed, the mid-17th century war establishes the systematic use of cannons and mortars. In the streets of Candia, countless loads of gunpowder are transported, parapets are reinforced, and sentinels are posted at every gate. The omens of a prolonged siege evoke growing fears. The populace dreads famine, disease, and exhaustion. Moreover, preparation for defense is costly. Local taxes increase, creating tensions among the population. The Venetian authorities attempt to reassure, arguing that reinforcements will soon arrive from Venice or from other supportive Christian states. Nevertheless, the Ottoman fleet remains active, and some relief convoys are intercepted. Each day, there is an expectation of seeing the Sultan's standards appear on the horizon. Apprehension mounts as the outcome becomes obscured. Meanwhile, Venetian diplomacy exhausts itself with efforts to rally other European powers to its cause. The emissaries of the Serenissima travel through the courts of Spain, France, and even England, which is undergoing a parliamentary revolution, altering its priorities. Each calculates the risks and benefits of an intervention against the Ottoman Empire. Without truly concrete support, Venice is forced to manage both militarily and financially to protect Crete. The Venetian Senate then adopts various fiscal measures, hoping to raise sufficient funds. Mandatory loans are imposed on the Venetian nobility, and additional customs taxes weigh on maritime commerce. Despite this, the Ottoman power does not weaken. Ibrahim Furs and Kara Mustafa ensure that the fleet receives reinforcements and munitions. Naval skirmishes extend to the areas around the Greek archipelago, sometimes reaching the approaches of Chios and Naxos, where Venetians and Ottomans vie for control of safe harbors. Meanwhile, Candia continues to strengthen its preparations, digging the countermine trench deeper and maintaining the morale of soldiers stationed on the ramparts. The citadel holds. In 1647, La Cannae and Rethymnon remained firmly under Ottoman control, while Candia, under siege, attempted to maintain its autonomy. The repeated landings in the Bay of Heraklion revealed the empire's determination to annihilate any resistance. The defenders responded with their artillery, but the Turkish galleys were continually renewed thanks to the resources of Anatolia. Within the city, each district committed to organizing militias who were raised, frequent inspections, assessed the state of provisions, and the strength of the ramparts. The Venetian officers encouraged the population to hold on despite their fear. At sea, Venice redoubled its efforts to intercept Ottoman convoys without achieving a decisive success. The hopes of external aid diminished as the 30 Years' War still engaged Northern Europe. Yet, the initial incident in Malta resurfaced in official speeches, serving as a pretext for the Sublime Porte to persist in its offensive. Crete, isolated, saw its fate tied to the determination of Candia, the last Venetian bastion about to face the early hours of an endless siege. No truce, nor foreseeable respite. When in May 1648, the Ottoman armies reached the outskirts of Candia, on the island of Crete, the city had already been preparing for a siege for several months. Following the previous offensives, the Venetians had strengthened their walls, dug ditches, and stockpiled provisions in hopes of withstanding a massive attack. The imminence of danger urged the population to be extra vigilant. The coastal watchtowers signaled every movement of vessels flying the Ottoman flag, and the campaniles, at the heart of the citadels, echoed to warn inhabitants of any intrusion reported in the hinterland. At the head of the Ottoman forces was Yusuf Pasha, a firm envoy from Istanbul, who had been tasked with intensifying pressure on the fortress of Candia. The figures mentioned in diplomatic correspondences of the time report about 50,000 men mobilized, including elite janissaries, troops from Anatolia, and regiments recruited in the Balkans. The declared objective was clear: to definitively isolate the city, cut off any possibility of reinforcement or maritime resupply, and force the defenders to surrender by force or exhaustion. Upon the arrival of these impressive troops, Yusuf Pasha began erecting lines of circumvallation, a kind of fortified belt encircling the perimeter of Candia. To establish this layout, the Ottomans employed thousands of workers and engineers. They raised palisades, dug trenches, and built parapets intended to protect the firing positions. Wooden bridges connecting these defensive structures allowed soldiers to move quickly from one advanced bastion to another. The Ottoman engineers also established provisional forts, sometimes called redoubts, in strategic places such as Mount Giuktas, a mountain overlooking the plain south of Candia. From this elevated point, it became possible to keep the city under constant surveillance and to anticipate any Venetian sortie that might threaten the Ottoman arrangement. The Venetian defense, on the other hand, was overseen by the Governor Generale di Candia, Francesco Molino. Coming from a great Venetian family, Molino had already gained experience in several maritime campaigns conducted in the Adriatic Sea and against the Ottomans. When he was appointed to this prestigious but perilous post, he quickly knew he would have to show great determination to extend the resistance. Under his authority, the local Venetian army comprised both native Venetians, Italian mercenaries, and Greek volunteers, determined to defend themselves. Although the garrison's numbers were far fewer than those of the Ottoman army, the defenders' advantage lay in the incomparable strength of the bastions that Venice had constructed in this Italian style. With their high walls, bastioned angles, and intersecting fire points, these fortifications remained in the mid-17th century among the most perfected in the Mediterranean basin. To put pressure on Candia, the Ottomans deployed an increasingly impressive heavy artillery. Among the siege pieces lined up against the Saint-André and Saint-Dimitri bastions were bombards capable of firing cannonballs weighing nearly 70 kilograms. Supplying these monumental cannons required both robust draft animals and large teams of artillerymen and servants to handle shells, powder, and cartridges. The amount of powder needed for each shot was considerable, making the use of this artillery particularly costly and the logistics heavy, yet it was devastatingly effective in shaking and cracking the walls. In this context, the Venetian engineers were constantly seeking new countermeasures, raising earthworks, reinforcing protections behind the outer walls, consolidating bastions with planks that absorbed the impact of the cannonballs, or digging countermoats designed to limit the effect of surface explosions. Despite these extensive preparations, the Ottoman threat quickly became concrete. Salvos of fire shook the city, creating a continuous rumbling that permeated the atmosphere from morning to night, adding permanent psychological tension to the defenders' ranks. From time to time, cannon shots even echoed during the night, forcing many of Candia's inhabitants to get used to the deafening noises as if they were part of their daily lives. From inside the ramparts, attempts were made to observe the Ottoman positions to spot any sign of a prepared offensive or a subterranean maneuver. Watchmen were stationed on the ramparts, taking turns at all hours of the day and night. Often, they reported to the governor the troop movements visible from the top of the bastions, allowing Francesco Molino to direct the few possible counterattacks. In order not to be trapped in a purely defensive posture, Molino regularly ordered sudden and aggressive sorties aiming to disrupt the Ottoman work sites. Indeed, if the enemy had time to consolidate their circumvallation lines, it would become almost impossible for Candia to receive any external aid. These daring assaults, although limited in scope considering the balance of power, aimed to damage the opposing fortifications, destroy artillery equipment, and waste precious time for the Sultan's soldiers. The Venetians attacked with a mix of infantry equipped with muskets and pikes, supported by a few cavalrymen who primarily sought to sow panic among the light Ottoman infantry. During these operations, which were undoubtedly brief and often bloody, the discipline of the Ottoman army sometimes appeared shaky. However, this did not account for the swift reaction of the Turkish officers, who promptly recalled their soldiers nearby in the lines. Quickly, the Venetians were forced to retreat behind their walls to avoid heavy losses. A crucial geographical feature in the defense of Candia lay in its aqueduct system, designed to supply the city with drinking water. Historically, the island of Crete was subject to arid summers, and the urban population heavily depended on these hydraulic infrastructures. The Ottomans, aware of this vulnerability, undertook to find and cut these conduits, hoping to eventually starve the city of water. In the months following the siege's establishment, they organized several patrols tasked with inspecting the areas around Candia, valleys, hills, isolated gorges. They searched for any intake point, any diversion likely to channel water to the fortress. If they spotted a section where these waters flowed abundantly, they would methodically destroy or divert it. Some segments were channeled underground through masonry galleries, while others, older ones, still featured terracotta pipes, possibly dating back to the Roman or Byzantine era. The Ottomans did not hesitate to dismantle them stone by stone, thereby annihilating the vital supply of fresh water to the defenders. As the external pressure increased, panic grew in the city. The first signs of shortage emerged in the heart of the summer of 1648, when the level of the cisterns began to drop. The Venetian authorities ensured water rationing, establishing priorities. The hospital, where war wounded were treated, was to be supplied before any other structure, while the most vulnerable families, those without private wells, were allowed to draw a modest amount, monitored by municipal guards. In the streets of Kandy, women and children were sometimes seen queuing in front of small conduits or improvised basins. According to some accounts, the price of a simple bucket of water, already high, skyrocketed, reflecting the residents' anxiety at the thought of quickly running dry. This growing scarcity also impacted sanitary conditions, as it became difficult to properly clean latrines or wash clothes, thereby increasing the risk of communicable diseases. Meanwhile, the Ottoman position strengthened day by day. The redoubts established on Mount Eustace offered a remarkable vantage point on the horizon. From these heights, Yusuf Pasha's officers could assess the coast and early detect the arrival of any ship likely to supply Kandy. The Turkish lookouts, relayed by smoke or lantern signals at night, communicated alerts to the Ottoman fleet patrolling the bay. As soon as a merchant vessel appeared, loaded with wheat, oil, or weapons destined for the besieged, it risked being intercepted by the Ottoman galleys, thus preventing the resupply of the city. Although the Venetian navy attempted incursions to break this setup, the balance of forces, sometimes reversed or uncertain, made each attempt hazardous. Ottoman coastal cannons, installed on elevated positions, could also reach enemy ships approaching too close to the beaches. The Venetians of Kandy, for their part, watched impotently these interception efforts while hoping to see a convoy break through the blockade. The determination to obtain maritime reinforcements remained crucial to maintain the morale of the inhabitants. Inside the city, Francesco Molino strived to maintain order. Food resources, although limited, still seemed sufficient for a few months, especially thanks to the reserves accumulated before the invasion. But water had become the primary problem. Venetian engineers considered urgently digging wells within the walls, hoping to find access to the groundwater table. But the water quality remained uncertain, and the drilling proved complicated under intense bombardment. With each new shock caused by a bombardment, the wells under construction sometimes collapsed. Internal landslides were not uncommon, and the population grew increasingly nervous. The Venetian nobles present in the city endeavored to preach courage to the inhabitants, highlighting the prestige of Venice and the island's importance for the Republic's trade routes. Nevertheless, the intensity of the Ottoman fire and the multiplication of redoubts around the rampart undermined the confidence of the besieged. The Saint-André and Saint-Dimitri bastions, located at crucial points of the wall, suffered heavy fire. The Ottoman bombers sought to create breaches in these essential structures to launch a decisive assault. The engineers of Kandy repaired the damage day and night, stacking bags of earth, stones, and beams in the most weakened areas. Improvised forges in the city operated at full capacity, manufacturing nails and irons to reinforce the scaffolding, while masons and stonecutters hastily repaired cracks in the buttresses. Meanwhile, defenders stationed atop these bastions continuously fired at any Ottoman soldier venturing too close to the ditches, hoping to maintain sufficient distance to prevent musket shots or the installation of new artillery batteries. Sometimes reports indicated that the Ottomans used armored boards or mobile mantlets to approach the walls, seeking the breach and pinpointing the precise area to concentrate their fire. This crossfire intensified when the Venetians noticed these approaching movements. As the months passed, the siege entered an increasingly harsh phase. The breakout attempts orchestrated by Moulay became rarer, as each excursion beyond the walls posed a major risk of irreparable losses. However, the garrison's captains insisted on maintaining these sporadic assaults, if only to delay the completion of Ottoman lines. On the other side, Yusuf Pasha could rely on the moral support provided by the Sublime Porte and the hope of quickly securing the capitulation of Candia, as the pressure on the city seemed extreme. Over the weeks, piles of rubble accumulated in the moats, resulting both from enemy fire and Venetian repairs that required the debris to be cleared. The outer ditches took on the appearance of a vast field of ruins, strewn with stones, broken beams, and sometimes bodies abandoned amidst the incessant firing. Each camp hoped that an unforeseen event might force the other to loosen its grip. The Venetians counted on a possible uprising within the Ottoman Empire, or an offensive by the Habsburgs, which could force Istanbul to redirect its troops. The Ottomans, for their part, mainly wagered on the logistical exhaustion of the garrison. Having conscientiously closed off all land routes, they focused their efforts on preventing supply by sea. The constant vigilance around the harbor of Candia made the passage of supply ships increasingly perilous. Even the most seasoned sailors, attracted by the bounty promised by Venice, had to contend with the risk of capture, shipwrecks, and cruel punishments if caught by the Ottomans. In such a climate, the city plunged into uncertainty, and a sense of an interminable siege took shape. At the beginning of 1649, the tension had not diminished. The wounds on the walls of Candia accumulated, but the fortress still held. However, the inhabitants were confronted with increasingly poor quality water, sometimes recovering brackish liquids from poorly maintained cisterns. The rare winter showers had not sufficed to replenish the reserves. The Venetian administrators had tried to collect rainwater in barrels placed on rooftops to extend its use. Nevertheless, epidemics loomed, as the stagnant water flooded the accumulated debris in the recesses. Seeking an urgent solution, engineers proposed extending a secondary aqueduct dating from Roman times, but it appeared partially destroyed, and any attempt at repair on the exposed ground resulted in worker losses under enemy fire. In this heavy atmosphere, Yusuf Pasha intensified the pressure by erecting new advanced artillery positions. With patience and manpower, he managed to establish batteries closer to the walls, taking advantage of the lulls between Venetian offensives to consolidate everything. The firing drew closer to the bastions of Saint-André and Saint-Dimitri, so much so that the defenders had to move several stockpiles of gunpowder to more remote locations, fearing the explosion of a depot. During the previous summer, some powder barrels had already exploded in an uncontrolled incident, causing many casualties and demonstrating the great fragility of Venetian logistics. Since then, Moulay demanded increased precautions in handling explosives, but he couldn't completely rule out the risk given the siege conditions. Gradually, makeshift shelters multiplied in the streets to protect the population from shell fragments. Many Candiotes took refuge in basements or even in underground corridors connected to the fortifications, turning storage rooms into dormitories. The wealthier residents, owners of solidly built houses, took in as many people as possible to try to protect them from projectiles. However, there was no place truly spared by artillery, and fear grew, fueled by the constant crash of bombings coming from outside. Nevertheless, in the spring of 1649, the determination of the defenders had not weakened. The inhabitants multiplied prayers in the churches, stirring hope for divine intervention that could change the course of history. Catholic priests, Orthodox monks, and even some passing Protestant clerics called for unity, convinced that only a total cohesion of the inhabitants could preserve the city. The war widows and orphans drew their courage from this spiritual momentum, while the improvised healers tried to stem the spread of diseases linked to the insalubrity of the dwellings. In the midst of this retrenched life, each dawn revealed the same spectacle, a cloud of dust raised by Ottoman teams, accompanied by the harsh sound of military drums and bugles, marking the new day of the siege. Yusuf Pasha's men, ever more numerous, pitched their tents along the conquered lands, and caravaneers crossed the lines bringing in provisions, ammunition, and reinforcements. It seems that Egyptian traders, drawn by profit, secretly supplied additional siege material, particularly large-caliber projectiles, capable of more effectively damaging the bastions. Meanwhile, at nightfall, campfires lit the horizon with a reddish glow, reminding the besieged that there was no fatigue on the enemy's side to divert them from their programmed conquest. More than ever, Kandy found itself encircled on all sides, like a jewel threatened by an iron vice. In a final effort of psychological resistance, Francesco Molino encouraged patrols around the inner edges of the ramparts to ensure that no Ottoman infiltration was being prepared in the shadows. The city gates opened only sparingly, and under the constant watch of trusted officers. Coded signals, made of torches or musket shots, alerted the entire garrison to potential enemy movements in the immediate vicinity. The narrow alleys took on the appearance of a defensive labyrinth, ready to welcome any intruder with crossfire and improvised blockades. This meticulous organization, inherited from Venetian military tradition, aimed to increase the adversary's difficulties if it managed to infiltrate the enclosure. Despite this fierce will to hold firm, rumors of negotiations were already circulating, fueled by certain diplomats who, from the outside, were trying to play the mediation card to reduce human losses. Molino's informants reported that the Sultan primarily wished to humiliate the Serenissima, whose decline in the Mediterranean would serve the Ottoman expansion policy. However, no official proposal was made at this stage. The Turkish military leaders evidently preferred to force a total surrender rather than accept a compromise, and they could count on the decisive advantage of thirst that began to gnaw at the defenders. In the city quarters now, every drop of water was counted. The dry fountains were covered with dust, and reports of tensions within the garrison emerged when some soldiers, panicking, attempted to seize concealed liquid reserves. On the surface, the wall still stood, and the Venetian cannons fired sporadically. But it was clear that the Ottoman grip was gradually tightening, offering Kandy no other choice than a heroic surge, a miraculous intervention, or inevitable capitulation. Hence, the siege clearly entered a new dimension, where the mastery of water became a vital issue, on par with artillery, bastions, or acts of bravery. If the coming months promised to be painful, it remained to be seen how far the endurance and loyalty of the city to Venice could go, faced with an army whose numbers seemed inexhaustible and whose logistical organization appeared exemplary. Between the thirsty city and the patient adversary, the confrontation was turning each day more into a deadly duel. In the mid-17th century, as the Siege of Candia dragged on for several years, the war between the Republic of Venice and the Ottoman Empire took on a war of attrition. In 1650, the fortified city, capital of the island of Crete, was subject to incessant fighting. The Italian-style fortifications, with their massive ramparts and moats, defied Ottoman tenacity. Since 1648, the Sultan's soldiers had multiplied their attacks, trying to shake the Venetian defenses from within. The fields around Candia were devastated, food supplies dwindled, and reinforcements struggled to break through the maritime blockade. By 1650, it became clear that no swift conquest was imminent. The confrontation turned into a slow and technological duel, intensified by sapping tactics and soon by terrible epidemics. Military engineers became crucial. On both sides, experts in siegecraft competed in ingenuity to detect weaknesses in the opponent's fortifications. On the Ottoman side, Sabas the Cretan, an engineer of Cretan origin serving the Sultan, tried to unlock the secrets of the bastions. Opposite him, G. Sardi and G. Lurini, veteran Italians, perfected fortification techniques. Sardi excelled in the art of geometric works, while Lurini focused on mastering underground drains. All three sought to surprise the enemy by erecting protected galleries and placing explosive charges as close as possible to the foundations. The Mouse Gallery became one of the most feared methods, a mining tunnel, so cramped that sappers progressed hunched over, loaded with barrels of gunpowder, intended to blow up a specific section of the rampart. The Ottomans resorted to teams specially trained to handle picks and charges in the dark. To counter these offensives, the Venetians installed underground listening bells, a kind of resonator designed to detect the slightest sound of digging. As soon as a suspicious noise was heard, a countermine was triggered to divert or trap the enemy tunnel. Starting in 1651, the plague struck the civilian population of Candia. Venetian and Cretan doctors tried to isolate the sick, but drinking water became scarce and hygiene remained precarious. The disease spread, killing more than 8,000 civilians and 5,000 soldiers. The authorities wanted to evacuate the infected outside the walls, but the fighting prevented any effective measure. Burials were hurried, and psychosis gripped the city, already undermined by hunger and enemy shells. Despite the contagion, the work of the sappers continued. Each side hoped to exploit the other's weakness. The Ottomans solidified the outer lines, monitoring any sortie by the besieged day and night. In the tunnels, there was fear of encountering the adversary around the bend of a gallery. The fighting there was brutal. The slightest collapse could bury the attacker as well as the defender. Despite the ravages of the plague among officers and soldiers, the will to continue digging did not waver, as a single well-placed tunnel could overturn the outcome of the siege. At sea, Venice attempted to alleviate Ottoman pressure. The Serenissima fleet wanted to blockade the Dardanelles, but could not control all the flows. In 1652, the blockade loosened when a Genoese convoy sought to resupply Candia. The Venetians hoped to outsmart Ottoman vigilance, but enemy galleys appeared off Capsa and dispersed the convoy. Part of the supplies was captured, depriving the garrison of vital support. This local defeat weakened the defenders and strengthened the Ottoman conviction that strict maritime control would eventually strangle the city. Venetian engineers built new counter-galleries to anticipate Ottoman tunnelers, but sometimes certain galleries turned out to be useless due to a lack of reliable data. Sappers got lost, exhausted themselves, and wasted powder and time. Officers tried to coordinate these works. Every pick, every plan had to be recorded to avoid duplication. The Ottomans, meanwhile, frequently changed the location of their tunnels, forcing the Venetians to monitor a tentacular underground front. Thus, the war bogged down in a labyrinth of mines, dreaded for its deadly traps. In these dark times, a remarkable episode is the daily mass led by the Capuchin Lorenzo de Chio. Arriving amid the turmoil, he provides moral support to the sappers, officiating in an improvised alcove. By the light of a few torches, he blesses pickaxes and barrels, hears confessions from those fearing they might never see the surface again. His courage is praised by all, for he never flees the galleries even when explosions echo. This spiritual figure brings a glimmer of humanity amidst the mud, fear, and epidemics. The massive use of powder kegs becomes common, although handling them remains perilous. Accidental explosions occur, triggered by a spark in the confined air. The chemists, often from firework guilds, strive to stabilize the powder. Yet, the slightest mistake reduces teams and tunnels to nothing. The Venetians encourage their miners with bonuses, while the Ottomans promise a rich bounty once the city is taken. This race for rewards heightens the risks, as each advance can be fatal for the sappers. Religion morally supports all armies. While Lorenzo de Chio works underground, Ottoman imams unite their soldiers through prayer. This fervor maintains moral order amid suffering and fear. In Kandy, processions and services follow one another to ward off the plague at the risk of worsening the contagion. The authorities struggle to limit these gatherings, sometimes seen as the only divine hope. Protests multiply as the population accuses the government of neither stemming the plague nor stopping the fighting. Despite everything, resistance persists, driven by the hope that Providence might turn the tide. Between 1653 and 1654, the situation brings little decisive progress. Venetian sorties beyond the walls, though courageous, are systematically thwarted by the Ottoman resistance, now accustomed to swiftly reacting to sabotage attempts. The enemy trenches, reinforced by sandbags and thick planks, withstand musket and light artillery fire. At night, the Venetians sometimes try to destroy these advanced works, but Ottoman sentinels keep watch. Skirmishes multiply, causing as many losses among attackers as defenders. In the tunnels, mining and countermining techniques expand further. Each sap captain has his own approach. Some prefer to open vast galleries to accumulate maximum powder, while others advocate for more numerous, narrower tunnels to gradually create multiple cracks under the same bastion. Ottoman engineers, spurred by promises of honors, compete with ingenious plans to bypass Venetian traps. The Venetians, on their side, refine the use of small chained barrels, set off in series to trigger successive detonations. The besieged endure constant harassment of cannonades, skirmishes, and sap operations. The plague is not eradicated, and persistent high mortality sometimes forces burying bodies in mass graves. Living conditions in Kandy remain hostile. Supplies are irregular, wells are contaminated, and sewers overflow. The wealthier try to flee the city, sometimes bribing guards, while the majority endure bombardments and shortages. Local commanders, divided over tactics, hesitate between passive defense and limited assaults. Advocates of a more offensive action wish to surprise the enemy, while others deem the maneuver too risky, given the weakness of troop numbers. Ultimately, very few concrete measures are applied. The Ottomans, despite some logistical difficulties, continue to receive reinforcements. New cannons brought in from Anatolia aim to test the strength of the bastions. The Imperial engineers also test incendiary projectiles to destroy the Venetian supply stores. The Ottoman front gradually forms a cordon of redoubts almost completely encircling Candia. In the surrounding villages, inhabitants suffer requisitions and diseases, while others, in order to survive, place themselves under Ottoman protection. The city's urban development is frozen. No construction sites progress, and artisans tirelessly repair the breaches opened by the artillery. The engineers still measure the depth of the ditches and the thickness of the weakened walls, hoping to find the flaw in the Ottoman armor. On their side, the Sultan's sappers accumulate stocks of gunpowder hidden in rudimentary shelters. No one knows if a final assault, a mine collapse, or a new epidemic will turn the tide. As the months go by, sporadic skirmishes break out around the city, with no significant gain for either side. Thus, the year 1654 ends in uncertainty, with both adversaries seeming to sink further into this endless conflict. For the military stationed in Candia, daily life consists of an alternation of guard duty, hasty repairs, and rare food distributions. Sentinels posted on the bastions note every suspicious movement in the Ottoman camps, fearing the sudden appearance of new war machines. The inner streets, cluttered with debris, become difficult to navigate, and episodic collapses bring down roofs already weakened by the bombings. At nightfall, the population huddles, listening to the distant pounding of enemy picks. Messengers sometimes attempt to leave the city to join the Venetian positions on the north coast, but few return unharmed. Those who manage to cross the enemy lines report tales of ravaged villages, destroyed crops, and separated families. These accounts, far from breaking Candia's resistance, instead fuel the anger and the will to hold out until the end. The Venetian leaders, though exhausted, assure that men will continue to defend each bastion, hoping for providential reinforcements or a diplomatic turnaround to change the balance. As the weeks pass, it becomes clear that the siege will drag on for a long time, and morale oscillates between determination and exhaustion. Some officers, deprived of sleep, consume opium-based remedies to stay alert during watches. The atmosphere in the barracks swings between forced camaraderie and latent anxiety. Yet, no one wishes to yield the initiative to the enemy, proving that the spirit of resistance remains alive. The period from 1654 to 1657 in the Mediterranean is marked by a military and diplomatic escalation between the Republic of Venice and the Ottoman Empire. At the heart of this tension lies the Dardanelles Strait, a strategic passage connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and by extension, to Istanbul. This route is crucial for trade and troop movement. Since the beginning of hostilities in Candia on the island of Crete, Venice seeks to break the Ottoman supply lines coming from Anatolia and the Balkans. The Ottomans, for their part, want to fully secure their maritime routes to supply their forces on the Cretan theater. In 1654, tension peaks when Venetian fleets, commanded by various admirals eager to show their audacity, approach dangerously close to Ottoman defenses. The Ottoman Empire, aware of the importance of controlling this passage, sends warships to neutralize any blockade attempt. The precursor to several major naval battles begins to take shape. The balance of power remains. To weaken the Ottoman naval power, Venice set out to launch a swift strike in the Dardanelles in the spring of 1654. The Venetian admirals, well aware of the numerical superiority of the opposing fleet, relied on the element of surprise and the agility of their modern galleys. The initial engagement saw artillery exchanges that were fairly balanced, with each side testing the other's strength. However, Venice was unable to completely block access to the Aegean Sea, as the Ottoman fortresses erected along the coasts constantly monitored any suspicious movements. At that time, the Ottoman hierarchy was led by traditional viziers, but discontent was brewing among the Janissaries. The prolongation of the Cretan War was putting the imperial economy under pressure, creating fertile ground for internal rivalries. In the face of these tensions, Venetian diplomacy redoubled its efforts to find allies in Western Europe. It was in this context that some foreign captains, lured by the prospect of financial gain and glory, joined the service of the Serenissima. One of the significant episodes of this sequence is the participation of Dutch and French captains, including Van de Velde and Beaulieu, who joined the Venetian fleet around 1655. Van de Velde, known for his experience in open sea navigation, proposed harassment tactics based on speed and mobility. Beaulieu, a seasoned French officer, brought expertise in the art of boarding, reinforced by his experience in conflicts against Spain. These foreign reinforcements, though limited in numbers, reinvigorated the Venetians, eager to prove they could still stand up to the Ottoman Empire. In response, the Sublime Porte accelerated ship production and replaced some officers deemed incompetent. The shipyards in Istanbul worked day and night to launch new galleys and caravels. In the summer of 1655, the competition intensified when the Venetian ships, now better equipped, attempted a daring new passage through the strait. This maneuver immediately triggered an Ottoman response, leading to the first of 4 direct and intense naval battles. The first confrontation, which occurred at the end of 1655, saw the Venetian fleet attempting a bold breakthrough equipped with light galleys and militarized merchant ships. The objective was to surprise the Ottoman garrison, stationed near the fortresses on the Asian shore. However, the Ottomans reacted quickly, maneuvering their squadrons from the European shore to outflank the Venetians. The fighting lasted several hours, with each side trying to minimize losses by taking advantage of the low visibility caused by morning fogs. The outcome remained indecisive, but the Venetians withdrew to avoid total encirclement. The second clash took place in the spring of 1656 near Cape Helles, at the very entrance of the Dardanelles. It was then that Lazzaro Mocenigo, a famous Venetian admiral, managed to rout the Ottoman squadron. Taking advantage of a favorable wind, he inflicted significant damage on several enemy galleys and even captured an Ottoman flagship. This victory galvanized the Republic of Venice, which saw it as a sign of revenge against a series of recent setbacks. Despite this success, the Venetian fleet could not immediately capitalize on the advantage gained, as it lacked supplies and sustained several damages. The ships had to be hastily repaired in allied ports, which allowed the Ottomans to reorganize their defenses. While the Grand Vizier in place lost the Sultan's confidence, the Sublime Porte decided to dismiss him, an action that catalyzed the emergence of a new faction within the imperial government, the Köprülü. Led by energetic viziers, this lineage proved ready to modernize the army and restore Ottoman authority over all contested territories. Meanwhile, on the Venetian side, diplomacy was intensely active in seeking financial aid from the major European courts, notably in Paris and Madrid. However, Cromwell's England, focused on its own maritime conflicts, was reluctant to support the Venetian effort. This difficulty in securing subsidies complicated the maintenance of the squadrons and delayed some crucial expeditions. Fatigue grew among the crews, already greatly tested. At the same time, the existence of these naval battles resonates across Europe, prompting the curious and adventurers to join the conflict. Venice, aware of the appeal of its defensive struggle, welcomes engineers and officers from Germany, Flanders, and even Sweden. Yet, these reinforcements remain disparate and unfamiliar with the peculiarities of the Mediterranean. The changing winds, treacherous currents, and constant proximity to coastal fortresses complicate every maneuver. On the Ottoman side, internal debates emerge about the relevance of investing more resources in the fleet at the expense of the land army. The Köprülü, keen to restore the empire's image, advocate for a sustained naval effort to definitively expel the Venetians from the Aegean waters. The shipyards of Izmir and Galata receive additional funds, allowing for the construction of more sturdy ships with improved cannons. During this phase, the confrontation extends to the surrounding islands, sometimes involving local populations torn between fear of Ottoman reprisals and hope for Venetian support. The violent cycle intensifies. In 1656, the naval struggle reaches a decisive turning point when the Republic of Venice achieves a memorable victory under the command of Lazzaro Mocenigo. This admiral, renowned for his mastery of winds and tides, leads a diverse fleet, including Venetian galleys, captured frigates, and ships rented from independent captains. With a force of 100 vessels, Mocenigo positions himself near the island of Lemnos to intercept an important Ottoman convoy en route to the Dardanelles. The confrontation, lasting 2 days, ends with the explosion of an Ottoman flagship and the capture of several caravels loaded with provisions. This victory has a major strategic impact, delaying the deployment of reinforcements bound for Crete. In Istanbul, the news exacerbates political instability, fueling the Köprülü's argument that the war should be pursued more aggressively. Meanwhile, Venice widely broadcasts this achievement, sending triumphant reports to European courts, hoping thereby to rally subsidies and consolidate its position. Festivities arise in the Serenissima. However, these successes at sea are not enough to reverse the overall course of the War of Candia. The land battles in Crete drag on and require a continuous flow of soldiers, weapons, and ammunition. This pressure on Venetian finances further motivates the search for external support. A diplomatic mission is dispatched to Paris to seek help from the French monarchy, known for its growing influence since the reign of Louis XIII and the action of Cardinal Mazarin. Simultaneously, emissaries are sent to Madrid, hoping that Spain's hostility towards the Ottoman Empire would lead to subsidies. But Venetian diplomacy encounters competing priorities. France is recovering from the Fronde, an internal opposition movement, and Spain is struggling to recover from its war against the United Provinces. England, governed by Oliver Cromwell after the Parliamentary Revolution, is focused on its maritime rivalry with the Netherlands, making any commitment against the Ottoman Empire unlikely. The Serenissima finds itself isolated, despite unfulfilled promises of alliances. Faced with these diplomatic constraints, Venice explores a bold idea: the construction of a floating fort called Castello. This device, intended to bombard the Bosphorus and directly threaten Istanbul, consists of a vast platform armed with long-range cannons, able to move thanks to a system of oars and sails. The declared objective is to exert psychological pressure on the Ottoman capital, hoping to force a withdrawal of the forces operating in Crete. Venetian engineers focus on the plans for this mobile fortress, envisioned as a major innovation in the art of naval warfare. However, the project raises controversies within the Venetian Senate itself. Its astronomical cost and logistical issues, such as continuous supply of gunpowder and food, raise concerns. Moreover, several admirals doubt the maneuverability of such a structure on the high seas. Despite the initial enthusiasm, the construction of this castello is eventually halted. The dream of a threat to Istanbul vanishes. The fourth and final Battle of the Dardanelles in 1657 confirms Venice's difficulty in imposing a lasting blockade. While the Venetian admirals hoped to capitalize on previous victories to annihilate the Ottoman fleet, they were met with unfavorable weather conditions and fierce resistance from the defenders. The Ottomans, reorganized by the Köprülü faction, deployed considerable resources this time, with new galleys featuring advanced artillery and better-trained crews. The artillery exchanges reached an unprecedented level of violence, destroying several Venetian ships and causing numerous human losses. Despite some tactical successes, the Republic of Venice ultimately had to withdraw to preserve what was left of its fleet. This forced retreat shattered the morale of the sailors, especially since diplomatic objectives were not achieved. The promised support from various European courts was lacking, highlighting the fragility of alliances. From then on, the Mediterranean chessboard proved more fragmented than ever. Tensions persisted, foreshadowing difficulties in the region. In the mid-17th century, the Ottoman Empire found itself at a strategic crossroads as the Long War for Crete, also known as the War of Candia, dragged on, and the finances of the Sublime Porte were severely strained by military expenditures. In Istanbul, the young Sultan Mehmed IV delegated a large part of his power to the high administration. Grand viziers succeeded one another without necessarily managing to stabilize the situation. It was in this context that Köprülü Mehmed Pasha emerged as a determined statesman aiming to strengthen the authority of the Ottoman court. His arrival in 1656 marked the beginning of a period of reform that became more visible from 1658 onward. Despite his reputation for relentless rigor, he was known for his skill in handling internal diplomacy, military organization, and fiscal strategy. He gradually gained the Sultan's trust, who expected him to restore order and reaffirm Ottoman power on multiple fronts. Further upstream, significant unrest shook the ranks of the Janissaries, an elite infantry corps renowned since the Middle Ages for its strict discipline and combat effectiveness. The Janissaries had long been the backbone of the Ottoman army, the result of a recruitment system called Devshirme, which took young Christians from the Balkans to train them in Muslim faith and warfare in service of the Sultan. However, in recent years, many Janissaries no longer adhered to the strict codes of their order. Indiscipline manifested in mutinies, refusals of pay deemed insufficient, and interference in the political sphere. Firmly supported by the imperial court, Köprülü Mehmed undertook a purge intended to remove the seditious elements. His clear objective was to restore a coherent, obedient, and well-trained army to support the empire's territorial ambitions. This process, though unpopular among the soldier factions affected by the sanctions, quickly brought benefits. The authority of the Grand Vizier was reinforced, and loyal officers were promoted to key positions to strengthen command across all operational theaters. Parallel to this military reorganization, Köprülü Mehmed tackled the sensitive issue of Taimars. The Taimar system, inherited from earlier times, consisted of granting Ottoman cavalrymen, known as sipahis, land revenues in exchange for their armed service. These domains, distributed throughout the empire, provided both financial support and a way to keep the feudal cavalry in a state of permanent readiness. Over time, many lands deemed vacant because their holders were dead or deposed were no longer officially re-registered. This led to a colossal loss for the imperial treasury, as taxes on these dormant Taimars were sometimes bypassed or illegally seized by local notables. Köprülü Mehmed thus launched a true fiscal recovery campaign by meticulously taking inventory of all Taimars, highlighting irregularities, and imposing new contributions on those who were not paying their dues. This reinforced taxation ensured additional revenue to fund military campaigns, which the empire greatly needed to maintain its stance against opposing coalitions in the Mediterranean and Central Europe. At the same time, the rise of the Ottomans is not limited to mere internal reorganization. The Grand Vizier believes that in order to deliver a decisive blow to the Republic of Venice in the War of Candia, it is necessary to prevent it from receiving any potential support from the Habsburgs, whose territories stand in Central Europe. However, the latter have shifting ties with some princes of Transylvania, a region located in present-day Romania, where the interests of a mostly autonomous nobility often oscillate between Ottoman suzerainty and Habsburg alliances. In 1658, Köprülü Mehmed chose the path of a targeted offensive in Transylvania, seeking to more firmly subject it to the Sublime Porte, and in doing so, to isolate the Habsburgs from any joint action with Venice. He thus sends seasoned contingents comprised of regular cavalry, infantry skilled in siege techniques, and mercenaries rallied for the occasion. This maneuver, simultaneous with the continuation of the Cretan campaign, aims to disperse enemy forces on multiple fronts. In the Aegean Sea, the situation remains focused on Candia, today's Heraklion, the principal Venetian stronghold on the island of Crete. The Ottoman troops stationed in front of the city have already suffered several partial setbacks in previous years, and the cannonades have caused numerous casualties on both sides. The arrival of about 20,000 Cretan reinforcements in the Ottoman army consists of men enlisted from among the local populations, often under duress or attracted by the promise of pay. This incorporation illustrates the dominion of the Sublime Porte in certain regions of the island and demonstrates its ability to mobilize, sometimes forcibly, islanders to compensate for the wear of its ranks. Alongside these recruits, Hungarian military engineers, known since the Habsburgs' reign for their expertise in artillery, join the Cretan front. They bring with them lighter pieces than the traditional massive bombards, particularly 24-pounder cannons. These weapons, more mobile and faster to reload, notably allow for sustained fire on enemy ramparts, which alters the nature of the assaults. The Hungarian engineers also revived the idea of installing protruding batteries, capable of precisely bombarding specific bastions without resorting to bombards that are too heavy or too slow. Thanks to this modernization, the Ottoman lines are strengthened and aim to methodically undermine the resistance of Candia. The Ottoman leaders, spurred by the determination of Köprülü Mehmed, initiate an almost continuous cycle of attacks. For 6 months, the besiegers send about 80,000 shells onto the city, transforming some areas of the fortress into veritable fields of ruins. The Ottoman gunners are particularly relentless on the Saint-Pierre bastion, one of the strong points of Venetian defense. This portion of the rampart, built according to the Italian principles of bastion fortification, has the advantage of a wide angle of fire and a high point designed to counterattack cannonades. However, under the repeated violence of Ottoman fire, the walls crack, then partially collapse. The Saint-Pierre bastion thus suffers heavy damage, the entanglement of stones creating critical breaches that threaten the coherence of the defense. The Venetian soldiers try to hurriedly consolidate the impact points, constructing parapets of earth or sandbags to prevent the Ottomans from advancing. Despite these efforts, the reach and frequency of enemy fire remain formidable. As the shells continue to rain down, fire becomes a formidable problem in neighborhoods entirely constructed of wood or weakened masonry. To remedy this, the Venetian commander Andrea Corner, a figurehead of the island's resistance, devises an ingenious system to curb the flames. Hailing from a noble family of the Republic, Andrea Corner has proven himself as a galley captain and territorial governor, before being entrusted with a significant responsibility in the defense of Candia. He knows that the threat of fire, combined with incessant bombardment, could precipitate the fall of the city if the inhabitants and soldiers lose control. His idea involves constructing a whole series of tunnels designed not for offensive sapping, but for the transportation of water. Unlike miners' galleries, which typically aim to place explosive charges under enemy walls, these conduits are dug to deliver liquid to the main points of fire. The design of these tunnels, sometimes called water tunnels, relies on specialized masons and hydraulicians, assisted by soldiers who work day and night. The teams begin by locating damaged pipes and cisterns hidden under the fortress, as Kandy has an ancient underground network inherited from the Byzantine period and completed under Venetian rule. By diverting existing pipelines, Corner manages to channel water towards distribution reservoirs. From there, underground passages make it possible to quickly contain any outbreak of fire following Ottoman artillery strikes. The effectiveness of this system proves decisive when a volley of incendiary shells hits a residential area near the Saint-Pierre bastion. The collection basins, partly replenished by rainwater and a few local springs, provide enough water to extinguish the fire before it spreads to other sectors. This innovation slows the progress of destruction, prolonging the resistance and justifying the reputation of a city that will long refuse to surrender. However, due to a shortage of materials, repairs on the Saint-Pierre bastion progress slowly, and the breaches remain weak points to be monitored. The Ottoman miners, who have noticed the weakening of the curtain wall, now seek to further penetrate the defense by digging their own tunnels to blow up the remaining counterforts. Underground exchanges of explosives multiply, rendering the situation chaotic. The defenders must constantly examine the ground to detect vibrations revealing an imminent enemy mine. Under these conditions, Andrea Corner orders his officers to more closely coordinate the civil engineering, the gallery lookouts, and the hidden artillerymen. This close technical collaboration serves as an example on the Mediterranean scene, as few besieged cities had developed such a level of logistical anticipation and underground defensive engineering up to that point. On the Ottoman political scene, the reputation of Köprülü Mehmed grows proportionally with the intensity of this military action in Crete. The Grand Vizier is betting on a quick success to consolidate his authority, as the Topkapi court in Istanbul closely monitors the evolution of the siege, judging it to be a symbolic matter. Possession of Kandy asserts Ottoman presence in the eastern Mediterranean, and everyone knows that the reconquest of the island would have a considerable impact on the maritime routes between Europe and the Levant markets. However, despite the dispatch of reinforcements, the Ottoman advance remains hampered by the solidity of the Venetian fortifications and the still intact morale of the defenders. Köprülü Mehmed's officers also have to manage internal discontent. Some contingents complain about pay delays, and communication is not always easy between Turkish officers, Hungarian auxiliary troops, and Cretan recruits not used to Ottoman discipline. Moreover, the island's climatic conditions, especially in summer, exacerbate logistical difficulties. Heat, lack of drinking water, and steep paths slow down troop movements. In Transylvania, the offensive launched by the Ottoman Empire also causes some diplomatic complications, as the local prince, aware of Ottoman military superiority, tries to gain external support. The Habsburgs, already in constant tension with the empire, hesitate to get too involved on a front that could lead them to an open war for which they consider themselves unprepared. Köprülü Mehmed aims to solidify his suzerainty over Transylvania by demanding higher tribute and installing loyal garrisons in the fortresses of this principality. This maneuver removes the threat of a Habsburg counterattack through Royal Hungary, their central bastion in Europe. Thus, the Sublime Porte consolidates its hold on the northern periphery of the Danube while intensifying its efforts on the Cretan expedition. The prospect of a victory at Candia extends beyond a military objective. It is a matter of prestige, legitimacy, and control over commercial routes in the Aegean Sea. Venetian ships still attempt, at irregular intervals, to resupply the fortress with food and ammunition, despite the presence of Ottoman fleets monitoring the island's approaches. Over the course of the bombardments, the eastern part of the walls also becomes damaged, creating an atmosphere of desolation among the trapped civilian inhabitants. The Orthodox and Catholic churches, previously spared, begin to suffer from the shocks of the impacts. The Venetian officers, aware that the population might succumb to despair, strive to support morale by organizing food distributions when possible. From his headquarters, Andrea Corner also coordinates the defense of these sectors affected by Ottoman fire, deploying sappers to fill breaches and artisans to reinforce interior walls. The Venetians aim to prevent a wide and accessible breach that would allow the attackers to launch a general assault. The bombardments on Candia sometimes take the form of stone cannonballs, sometimes metal balls. In some cases, the Ottomans use explosive shells, a more common innovation among European engineers, but adopted in recent years by the Ottoman arsenal. These munitions contain a charge of powder inside a hollow shell, causing an explosion upon impact. This creates craters in the walls or causes fires, made more dangerous when the projectiles hit a storage place for powder or flammable materials. The Venetian soldiers attempt to predict the trajectory of these projectiles in advance, but their speed makes the maneuver challenging. It is reported that, on some nights, the glow of fires being ignited lights up the battlements, and the deafening sounds of artillery echo in the distant countryside of the island. Despite these ordeals, the tenacity of the defenders and Candia's massive structure prevent the Ottomans from achieving a swift success. The St. Peter's Bastion, partially in ruins, remains under Venetian control, although it is considered vulnerable. Andrea Corner has its perimeter reinforced with wooden palisades and the installation of smaller caliber cannons, placed on improvised platforms. The idea is to discourage any attempt to cross the outer ditches by maintaining constant fire on the Ottoman approaches. Meanwhile, Venetian cavalry, sometimes exiting through the fortress's secondary gates, seek to surprise Ottoman contingents on the surrounding slopes. These lightning sorties aim to slow the establishment of new enemy batteries. However, they cannot prevent the continuation of long-range fire on the city. The pace of 80,000 shells in 6 months, mentioned in several diplomatic correspondences, testifies to a persistence rarely seen before in the Mediterranean basin. This figure is also mentioned in accounts by French and Dutch observers, sometimes present on site as engineers or traders. The figure of Andrea Corner emerges increasingly as that of an unconventional military engineer. Unlike other Venetian commanders, coming from ancient aristocracy and more trained in ceremonial protocols than fieldwork, Corner is above all a man of practice. He does not merely issue orders. He often personally oversees the work and does not hesitate to venture into the underground galleries to inspect the advancement of the water system. Each morning, he gathers the master builders, sappers, and masons in a room adjacent to the walls to examine a detailed plan of the city. There, he studies the most threatened areas, points out those requiring urgent repairs, and directs teams according to the resources still available. With epidemics having decimated a large part of the workforce in preceding years, Corner must constantly request the participation of simple soldiers for excavation, even if it disrupts the personnel assigned to the garrison. In the meantime, Koprulu Mehmed, aware that the duration of the siege might weaken his prestige, intensifies the pressure. He orders the arrival of competent officers to further supervise the Cretan front, sending missives demanding daily reports on the progress of operations. The Ottoman officers on the ground, like some local pashas, take care to describe to their Grand Vizier the exceptional defensive responsiveness of Candia, the state of the walls, and the prospects of opening a decisive breach. They regularly mention the solidity of the Venetian fortification, the complexity of the bastion defenses, and the ingenuity of the opposing leaders. Despite the Ottoman firepower, the high command of the empire fears a prolonged stalemate, as extending the war means committing new financial resources and multiplying the risks of revolts in other provinces. The question of supply also plays a major role in the strategy of both sides. The Ottomans try to establish their footholds on the northern coast of Crete to stock provisions and ammunition. Tents and barracks spring up near the natural piers, where comings and goings of ships transport all the necessary materials to continue the siege. Caravans of camels and mules from Anatolia bring flour, rice, oil, and supplies to support the land army. On the other side, the Venetians continue, when they can, to send reinforcements, gunpowder, and food to Candia, often thanks to relief fleets dispatched from the Adriatic. These supply operations sometimes generate naval skirmishes off the coast of Crete or around the neighboring islands. This balancing act between the Ottoman blockade and Venetian attempts to pass through is reflected in Koprulu Mehmed's determination to constantly reinforce the naval forces while maintaining his terrestrial initiative. In this climate, the simultaneous offensive in Transylvania proves to be a bold, strategic choice. The Ottoman troops, occupied on two fronts, must maintain enough cohesion to prevent the enemy from taking advantage of a temporary weakening. Indeed, Koprulu Mehmed relies on the deterrent effect achieved in Transylvania to limit the direct involvement of the Habsburgs in the Cretan conflict. His reasoning is that as long as the Sublime Porte demonstrates its ability to strike in the Danube region, Vienna will hesitate to actively support the Venetian fleet or infantry with costly expeditions. In Transylvania itself, the local prince eventually recognizes Ottoman sovereignty, and the cautious Habsburg diplomacy limits its aid to discreet presences in certain negotiations or to the provision of indirect subsidies to Venice. Meanwhile, pressure does not ease on Crete, where the Ottoman cannons continue their fire day and night. To better coordinate all these operations, Koprulu Mehmed relies on a network of swift messengers, couriers on horseback, and light boats capable of transmitting his orders from Istanbul to the forward positions. Each week, he receives reports on the continuation of the siege, on the number of shells fired, on the progress in setting up the Hungarian batteries, and on the Venetian reactions. His responses, often brief and pragmatic, insist on the need to apply iron discipline, ensure that the purged janissaries are not replaced by new rebellious elements, maintain the taxation on already listed Timars, accelerate the conquest of Transylvania by breaking the resistance of Habsburg partisans, and above all, redouble the investment on the siege of Candia. He repeatedly reminds army captains and governors that a quick fall of the fortress would permanently solidify the status of the Ottoman Empire as a maritime bastion in southern Europe. In this regard, the 80,000 shells already discharged are merely a step. He anticipates new waves of assaults, hoping that the fortress will finally collapse under the relentless pressure. On their side, the defenders of Candia are not unaware of the fame and rigor of Köprülü Mehmed. The few Venetian spies in Ottoman territory report that the Grand Vizier has centralized power in Istanbul to the maximum, sanctioning failures and corruption with severity. The Venetian officers understand that there will be hardly any easy negotiations, and that the opposing determination, supported by a state in full overhaul, poses a serious threat to the Cretan citadel. Andrea Corner, in sporadic correspondence with the Venetian Senate, describes a formidable opponent with almost unlimited means, dominated by the unyielding will of a Grand Vizier entirely devoted to the expansionist cause. He sometimes requests fresh troops from the metropolis, but the Republic struggles to mobilize quickly due to multiple maritime fronts. Moreover, the distance between Venice and Candia causes delays, and each supply convoy must face the danger of Ottoman galleys patrolling the Aegean Sea. By the end of 1659, the impact of Köprülü Mehmed's reforms is felt throughout the Ottoman political framework, although not everything proceeds without friction. The Janissaries, purged, remain a formidable force, now more disciplined. The Taimars yield more revenue, reflected in the funding allocated to the campaigns. In Transylvania, the Sublime Porte foresees the conclusion of stricter vassalage agreements, while off the coast of Crete, the pressure increases on Candia. The St. Pierre bastion, already largely breached, undergoes new cannon fire from 24-pounders, more practical to maneuver on the rugged terrain. The defenders strive to fill the breaches with planks, stones, and sometimes even dampened textiles to withstand the fire. The Ottoman sappers, encouraged by the visible weakening of the bastion, accelerate their undermining work and continue to multiply mobile batteries. The water tunnel system designed by Corner nonetheless continues to limit the destruction caused by the flames. The city's inhabitants are hastily trained to pump water and navigate through these cramped galleries, where light is scarce. This represents a technical feat, but also an organizational tour de force, as it requires coordinating exhausted civilians, sleep-deprived soldiers, and constantly alert engineers. Chronicles of the time describe scenes of nocturnal chaos, where flaming projectiles plunge into the city, while rescue teams dive into the tunnels to fetch water before emerging onto the ramparts, dispensing buckets and water bladders. Despite the fatigue, the Venetians hold firm, aware that the adversary must still cross the moats and break the collective morale to seize Candia. Köprülü Mehmed's shadow, nevertheless, hangs over every decision, every bomb dispatch, every planned assault, as it is his centralizing impulse that maintains the pressure and invigorates the Ottoman effort daily. In the mid-17th century, the Republic of Venice, known as the Serene Republic, attempts to preserve its Mediterranean possessions. The island of Crete, and particularly the fortress of Candia, have been subjected to the constant pressure of the Ottoman Empire for several years. The Ottomans, in full expansionist ambition, aim to consolidate their control over the eastern Mediterranean and seriously threaten the Venetian positions, once adorned with bastion fortifications reputed among the strongest in the world. The defenders, exhausted by incessant battles, lack manpower and resources. In the face of this growing danger, Venice seeks allies willing to support the war effort and defeat the Ottoman naval power. However, France, under the regency of Anne of Austria and the authority of Cardinal Jules Mazarin, is gradually asserting itself as a leading European actor. Mazarin, the chief minister of the young Louis XIV, understands the strategic advantage France could gain from an intervention in the Mediterranean, the opportunity to extend its influence, strengthen its military reputation, and thwart the common enemy. However, French diplomacy proceeds cautiously, fearing to provoke the ire of other powers like Spain, freshly bound by the Treaty of the Pyrenees. It is in this climate of uncertainties that a secret agreement is negotiated to send a French expedition to the Cretan island, led by the Duke of Beaufort. The Duke of Beaufort, whose real name was François de Vendôme, is an unusual figure in the high French aristocracy. Grandson of Henri IV through the Bourbon-Vendôme lineage, he is related to King Louis XIV, but this closeness to the crown has not always worked in his favor. Son of César de Vendôme and Françoise de Lorraine, he was raised in an atmosphere where political intrigues and family rivalries constantly intertwined. Sometimes nicknamed the King of the Markets for his influence in certain Parisian circles, or dubbed the Agitator by his critics, Beaufort had already had run-ins with Cardinal Mazarin during the Fronde, that period of noble and parliamentary rebellion in France. He was even imprisoned at the Château de Vincennes, from which he made a spectacular escape. Yet despite these antecedents, Mazarin, a shrewd strategist, knows that Beaufort remains popular with Parisians and enjoys a certain military aura. By entrusting him with the expedition to Crete, the cardinal hopes to take advantage of his charisma and channel his abundant energy towards a cause that would serve the glory of France and, by extension, the reputation of Louis XIII's government. Beaufort, eager to prove his bravery, accepts the mission, seeing it also as an opportunity to etch his name in the annals of history, potentially breaking the Ottoman encirclement around Candia. The negotiation of a secret pact between Mazarin and the Republic of Venice illustrates the complexity of alliances in mid-17th century Europe. Following the turmoil of the 30 Years' War and the imminent signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, continental powers are trying to reorganize their spheres of influence. France emerges as a centralized and ambitious state, while Spain is slowly declining, still powerful but weakened by decades of conflict. Venice, on the other hand, has seen its maritime empire challenged by the technological and military advances of the Ottoman Empire, whose massive galleys and powerful artillery dominate several strategic passages. The pact between Mazarin and the Venetian authorities specifically plans for the dispatch of approximately 4,600 French soldiers, supported by 9 warships, to reinforce the garrison of Candia. The officers, recruited from both Atlantic and Mediterranean ports, often belong to the lesser nobility or newly affluent commoner families in search of glory and honorary connections. For Mazarin, this expedition is not only a means to counter the Ottoman push, it is also a grand gesture that would demonstrate to the rest of Europe France's ability to project its naval power to the far reaches of the eastern Mediterranean. Moreover, by facilitating the transport of artillery, ammunition, and provisions, France portrays itself as a protector of Christendom against the Ottoman advance, which could bolster its credit with the Holy See and other European courts. The preparations for the expedition begin discreetly, as Mazarin fears that England, under parliamentary influence, and Spain, freshly defeated, might seek to apply pressure to prevent the departure of the troops. The idea is to concentrate armament operations as much as possible in Toulon, an important French arsenal on the Mediterranean, while maintaining a high level of secrecy. The soldiers are carefully handpicked, mixing infantrymen, musketeers, and some companies of light cavalry, even if the utility of cavalry on an island remains limited. The 9 vessels, mostly ships of the line and frigates, are equipped with ready-to-use cannons. The French General Staff devises a route plan that avoids overly busy areas to minimize the risks of interception by Barbary corsairs or Spanish spies. Meanwhile, within the fortress of Candia, the Venetians, under pressure from Ottoman troops, are frantically organizing defense. Damaged walls are being reinforced, bastions are equipped with additional cannons, and wheat reserves are rationed. Everyone waits feverishly for the promised reinforcements, without knowing when they will actually arrive. The first French ships finally reach Cretan waters in the spring of 1660, offering the besieged a glimmer of hope in the dark night of an endless siege. The landing, which takes place at Calesa, a few kilometers from the heart of Candia, marks a psychological turning point for the defenders. Calesa, sometimes spelled Chalesa in old French and Italian documents, is a small fortified port that the Venetians still control, despite several Ottoman attempts to seize it. The arrival of the French fleet there has the effect of an exuberant parade. The ships display blue and gold flags. The crew shouts, hails in honor of Louis XIV, and the coastal artillery fires celebratory salvos. The Duke of Beaufort, as is his custom, knows how to stage himself. Clad in decorated armor, feather in his hat, he lands to the cheers of the local population. Contemporary accounts report that he salutes the Venetians and the Cretans by brandishing his sword, promising to liberate the island from the Ottoman threat. In the minds of his men, the Cretan venture takes on an epic character. It is a confrontation between Christianity and Islam, but also, for many, an opportunity to gain fortune and fame. The French soldiers are struck by the stern beauty of the Cretan coast, the smell of spices and salt in the air, and the difficulty of the terrain, made of steep hills and ruins from previous conflicts. Very quickly, Beaufort organizes a cautious advance towards Candia, securing the route with scouts and ensuring that no Ottoman ambush compromises their triumphant march. Once in Candia, Beaufort inspects fortifications worn down by a long siege. The Italian bastions, once admirable, show cracks due to bombardments. The powerful Ottoman artillery has already pierced breaches. The stocks of food and ammunition are running low, and the enemy controls the access to water. The French officers, more rigid, sometimes oppose the Venetian methods, deemed too defensive. Nevertheless, all agree to reinforce the walls and organize night patrols. The French presence revives general enthusiasm, despite the awareness of the growing danger. Every day, the shadow of the Ottoman banners grows.
This is Granny. I'm calling you because I just listened to your music. Girl, you were kicking it. I enjoyed it, Fred. I had Robin and I listening to it too. So we'll talk later. Bye-bye.
Determined to act, Beaufort conceives an audacious plan to attack the St. Louis Bastion at night, a religious symbol for the French. The preparations, conducted in secret, involve staging the troops and coordinating with the Venetian artillery. Some officers fear the Ottoman strength, notably the Janissaries, known for their discipline. Others see in this assault the opportunity to turn the tide. On the agreed evening, the soldiers equip themselves with muskets and pikes, ready to surprise the enemy. Hope is reborn, supported by the promise of shared glory. The name of St. Louis is already being whispered fervently. When the assault begins, the silence of the night is shattered. The French, led by Beaufort, gain an early advantage, driving out the Ottoman sentinels. Cries of victory echo up to the ramparts, where the Venetians follow the progress by the light of torches. But the Ottoman response proves swift. The Janissaries converge on the bastion, supported by arquebusiers and some light artillery pieces. The melee becomes chaotic. Smoke from the muskets fills the space. At the heart of the battle, Beaufort is suddenly struck and collapses. The shock shakes his men. In the confusion, no one manages to extract the injured Duke. The French lines retreat, fearing encirclement. By morning, neither body nor prisoner is found. Hypotheses abound: disappearance, capture, or death under the rubble. Nearly 1,200 French perish in this battle, a terrible blow for the contingent. The Venetians, already in difficulty, lament these losses that greatly weaken the defenses. Thus, the St. Louis Bastion remains in Ottoman hands. The absence of Beaufort, a charismatic figure, plunges the garrison into mourning and uncertainty. Many fear a grim fate.
Listen to your music. Girl, you were kicking it. I enjoyed it, Fred. I had Robin and I listening to it too. So we'll talk later. Bye-bye.
The French court soon learns of the news. Louis XIV, in effective power since the Fronde, realizes the scale of the disaster. Mazarin, to preserve the Treaty of the Pyrenees and spare the royal treasury, orders the withdrawal of the fleet. Losing a valuable ally, the Venetians feel their hope dwindling. In France, the presumed death of Beaufort arouses a wave of compassion and criticism. Some praise his heroism, others denounce an ill-prepared engagement. Ultimately, the abandonment of Candia further undermines morale, allowing the Ottoman Empire to consolidate its positions. Everywhere, indignation grows. The literary memory quickly seizes upon this failed expedition. In the Mazarinades, the political pamphlets of the era, circulates the image of the intrepid Candia, a fantasized fortress that the French would have wanted to save. Popular ballads exalt the bravery of Beaufort, vanished without a grave, presented as a martyr of the confrontation against the Ottoman Empire. Over the years, these tales fuel the legend, transforming military defeat into a heroic myth, mentioned in salons and history books. He survives. In 1663, the situation inside the fortified city of Candia, on the island of Crete, reached a critical point. For several years, the Ottoman army had been relentlessly besieging this Venetian place, causing supply breakdowns and a constant climate of tension. A distant possession of the Republic of Venice, Candia represented a symbol of resistance that its defenders, composed of Venetian soldiers, Greek militias, and volunteers from other cities, refused to let fall into the hands of their adversaries. However, food stocks began to run out, and everyone dreaded the moment when wheat, which had been the staple of their diet, would run out. Already the silos were visibly emptying, while continuous bombardments destroyed some storage areas and complicated transportation. The Venetian authorities, aware of the danger, tried to preserve the scant reserves for the greatest number. Rationing quickly became indispensable. At the beginning of 1663, military and civil authorities decreed a drastic reduction in the bread portion allocated to each soldier. Already weakened by long weeks of fighting and vigilance, they now had to settle for a piece weighing only 120 grams per day. This insufficient quantity not only affected the defenders' strength, but also their morale. Aware of the potential devastation of an emaciated army, the Venetian commanders sought solutions to maintain resistance at all costs. Some considered bringing wheat from bases still held by Venice elsewhere in the Mediterranean, but the Ottoman fleet stationed offshore made any delivery perilous. The maritime convoys were exposed not only to enemy artillery fire, but also to capricious winds that prolonged the journey, raising fears for the cargoes. The civilian population, on the other hand, bore the full brunt of these restrictions. Women, tasked with feeding their families, struggled to find enough to cook a complete meal. The children, already affected by the closure of makeshift schools, often found themselves begging in the streets, waiting for the distribution of some leftovers. The wealthiest of them resorted to stratagems to try to obtain a little more food, exchanging jewelry or promising services to corrupt officers. Agitation grew in some popular neighborhoods, where there were whispers that Venice no longer had the capacity to protect its subjects. Yet the fear of seeing the Ottoman army enter Candia remained stronger than the complaints, and most continued to follow orders from authorities, hoping for future supplies by sea or hypothetical reinforcements from Europe. In response to the scarcity of resources, ingenious rooftop gardens appeared, installed by the inhabitants and troops to try to increase their autonomy. In these unusual spaces, aromatic herbs, some hardy vegetables, and even small quantities of cereals were cultivated when the season allowed. The soldiers, combining constant vigilance with rudimentary agricultural labor, monitored their small plots as much as they kept watch on the ramparts. However, repeated bombardments constantly endangered these makeshift gardens. The weakened roofs were exposed to the impact of cannonballs, which could ruin weeks of effort in an instant. Despite everything, these ingenious initiatives testified to the defenders' fierce determination to survive and support the garrison. Another providential resource then revealed itself: pigeon raising, serving both as a source of animal protein and a means of communication with the outside. Indeed, beyond their nutritional value, pigeons are used as messengers to brave the Ottoman blockade and transmit coded messages to the few remaining operational Venetian outposts. The birds, raised in small improvised facilities, must be constantly protected. The enemy, having understood their importance, does not hesitate to target the dovecotes during its bombardments or to employ specialized archers to take aim at any bird rising above the ramparts. Despite this danger, the defenders persist, aware that even modest reinforcements could one day breach the Ottoman ranks to relieve the city. Sometimes, a pigeon manages to return, bearing fragmentary information about hypothetical convoys and ongoing diplomatic negotiations. While awaiting a miracle, each breeder strives to ensure the survival of their birds, whether by feeding them, caring for them, or designing new shelters. One of the most notable consequences of the depletion of wheat reserves is the skyrocketing prices on the black market. As early as 1663, the Maltese corsairs, whose ships scour the eastern Mediterranean, saw an opportunity to make immense profits from Candia's distress. Taking advantage of their knowledge of secondary routes, and sometimes with inside help within the Ottoman Empire, they managed to clandestinely introduce some grain shipments into the besieged city. But these high-risk deliveries are negotiated at exorbitant prices. Rapidly, the price of wheat multiplies by 14. Only a handful of the wealthiest inhabitants, or some officers with underground galleries to hide their treasures, can afford this overpriced bread. The authorities, though aware of the abuses, sometimes turn a blind eye, hoping that any external contribution will delay the collapse of the defense at the last minute. As the siege drags on, Venice desperately seeks new funding sources to support Candia's fortifications and meet the most urgent needs. It is in this context that the idea of a public lottery specifically aimed at raising funds for the war emerges during the year 1663. The Venetian administrators, in agreement with some great patrician families, decide to print tickets on the nearby island of Zante, still under Venetian control. These tickets, distributed in Crete, but also on the Republic's territory and as far as Dalmatia, promise various prizes, some purely symbolic, like honorary distinctions or fictitious titles. The goal is mainly to create a popular enthusiasm to gather fresh money. Each bet placed by participants partially contributes to buying gunpowder, siege materials, and paying the craftsmen tasked with maintaining the bastions. In practice, this lottery meets with mixed success. Many, disillusioned by the sacrifices already made, hesitate to spend the little money they still have on an uncertain gain. Yet, the Venetian administration tries to make it an event capable of restoring hope. Town criers regularly announce the sums collected, and a few modest posters promoting great patriotic causes can be seen around. Even within Candia, official collectors are appointed to gather the proceeds from each sold ticket, while maintaining strict accounting to prevent fraud. Some officers, aware of the prevailing distress, insist that part of the lottery's proceeds be distributed in the form of food or medicine. However, most of the collected funds are used to reinforce the already seriously damaged ramparts by the Ottoman artillery. The winter of 1664 brings an additional trial to the population of Candia, already beset by famine and diseases. That year, an unusual cold descends on the island, grounding many brave farmers still trying to cultivate the land around the city. Numerous sources report that snowflakes, rare in this region, briefly cover some districts. The rooftop gardens, as well as the tiny fields set up in the suburbs, suffer from these extreme conditions, compromising late harvests and causing the death of many plants. The defenders, already weakened, struggle to keep warm in accommodations designed for a more temperate Mediterranean climate. Maritime supplies, already very risky, become even more difficult to organize, as the rough seas and icy winds present an additional challenge for incoming ships. Extreme weather conditions also have direct repercussions on the stability of the fortification. The walls of Kandy, designed to withstand artillery, prove vulnerable when a severe cold snap occurs. Water seeping into certain cracks, caused by cannonball impacts, turns to ice and widens the breaches. During the winter of 1664, several segments of the outer wall, already battered by months of bombardments, begin to show alarming signs of weakness. Venetian engineers attempt to patch up the cracks with makeshift materials, sometimes using wood reinforced with metal plates, but the slow work of the frost regularly undoes their efforts. During the night of December 12 to 13, 1664, a partial collapse occurs on the seaward side, causing panic among the sentries who rush to try to contain the widening of the breach. In the darkness, groups of sappers and mere soldiers organize to plug the hole with whatever they can find: sandbags, beams salvaged from destroyed buildings, and even a disparate assembly of stones taken from civilian constructions. The objective is to prevent the enemy from immediately detecting the weakening of the defensive setup. Cannons move to cover the fissured area, fire sporadically to give the illusion of full control of the situation. However, there are whispers that if the winter prolongs and more collapses occur, Kandy might become even more exposed to new assaults. Officers order additional patrols in this sector and require a daily report on the evolution of the fissure. The slightest collapse could become, in the eyes of the Ottomans, an ideal breach for launching a final assault. The fear of this assault then haunts every corner of the fortress. While some urge fortifying the repairs, others implore the Virgin to protect them. At dawn, new cracking is discovered along the neighboring parapets. Masons, sometimes replacing soldiers, patch the growing cracks as best as they can. Behind the battered walls, the prospect of life-saving supplies remains uncertain. In the icy December air, the cathedral bells toll quietly, reminding everyone of the precarious fragility of their last refuge. In 1666, the war between Venice and the Ottoman Empire around the fortress of Kandy reaches a critical phase. The Grand Vizier Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed, successor to the reformer Köprülü Mehmed, reorganizes his troops to reinforce the Ottoman artillery. He brings in Austrian siege mortars, captured during previous campaigns. These weapons, capable of projecting projectiles weighing nearly 200 kilograms, represent a formidable innovation in 17th century siege warfare. Once intended to counter the Ottoman advance in Central Europe, these massive bronze tubes now turn against the bastion of Kandy. The Turkish gunners exploit the curved trajectory of these mortars to strike inside the city and weaken the Venetian resistance. This technical reinforcement, coupled with new incendiary munitions, pushes the defensive limits imposed by the Italian-style fortification. Faced with the arrival of these reinforcements, the Venetian garrison fears an intensification of bombardments never before seen. Captured Hungarian engineers also contribute to the effort, adjusting the gun carriages to optimize each shot. At the same time, the use of petroleum bombs is becoming widespread in the Ottoman camp. These jars, filled with bitumen, sulfur, and other flammable substances, cause fires that are difficult to control. Launched by mortars or catapults, they explode, projecting a flaming mixture that seeps into the nooks of the fortifications and sets roofs, galleries, or even food stores on fire. Under the impact of these bombs, the Venetians noticed a sudden increase in fires in Kandy, forced to mobilize more barrels of water and sand to prevent the spread. Groups of sappers, often guided by religious figures, attempt to drown the flames in the underground corridors, sometimes at the cost of real sacrifices. Amid this chaos, the deafening roar of mortar fire shakes the population, who flee to caves or makeshift shelters. The engineers of the Serenissima must revise their defense plans to counter this new wave of destruction. Some accounts report that the air becomes unbreathable, saturated with toxic fumes. During the summer of 1666, the combined power of heavy mortars and incendiary devices caused the partial collapse of the Martinengo rampart, a section known for its sturdiness. Repeated bombardments fractured the masonry, creating a pile of debris dubbed glacis breach by the besiegers. Ottoman engineers exploited this gap to place explosive charges directly under the foundations, hoping to provoke an even larger collapse. As the stone blocks crumbled, the Turkish army prepared to test Venetian resilience. The opening thus formed threatened to provide a crucial access point for the infantry, waiting for orders to launch a frontal assault. Worried, the defenders redoubled efforts to fill the hole with sandbags and reinforced beams while maintaining a fire barrage to discourage enemy advancement. On the rampart, sentries observed the incessant activity of the Turkish sappers day and night, watching for the moment when the breach might widen further. A single additional collapse, they believed, would be enough to seal their fate. In response, the Venetians deployed an unusual invention, the rotating mantelet. This thick shield on a pivot allowed artillerymen to protect themselves and retaliate without exposing themselves. Made of sturdy wood, reinforced with metal plates, it could be quickly maneuvered to block the impact of shrapnel. Thanks to this device, cannon operators adjusted their firing angle, then immediately replaced the mantelet in front of them. The effect proved particularly useful against Ottoman salvos, as bomb fragments and stone shards made any static position perilous. Examples of this shield were already circulating towards Corfu, where similar protection was being considered. Turkish officers, surprised by this technique, sought methods to neutralize these mobile defensive positions, while Venetian engineers continually improved their design. The adoption of the rotating mantelet prolonged Cretan resistance, offering a reprieve to garrisons exhausted by relentless firing. Despite its effectiveness, this countermeasure did not guarantee invincibility. Each impact weakened the defenses. Ottoman efforts were not limited to simple siege artillery. Skilled sappers dug tirelessly under the damaged walls, carrying powder charges to mine the weakened sections. The Grand Vizier's engineers considered the Martinengo breach a critical point, convinced that a total collapse of this bastion would hasten the fall of Candia. Assaults intensified, combining mortar fire and incendiary bomb launches, aiming to force defenders to disperse their resources. Each night, Venetian watchers listened to the ground with listening bells, trying to detect the advancement of enemy galleries. If any suspicious vibration was perceived, countermines were ignited to try to trap the Ottoman soldiers. In this underground ballet, patience and composure became vital. Yet, despite Venetian determination, the rampart structure wavered under the cumulative effect of the shocks. The cracks lengthened, hinting at the imminent risk of a large-scale ground assault. Stocks of reinforcing materials dwindled. Despite these attacks, the garrison devised new counter-battery tactics. Venetian officers organized crossfire to disrupt the aiming of the Ottoman mortars, hoping to deflect the projectile's trajectory. Simultaneously, Turkish bombers adjusted the powder load to maximize range and precision. Streams of molten metal, sometimes mixed with crushed glass, were hurled onto the Venetian galleries to dislodge the sappers. Conditions became hellish. No one could gather in the open without risking mortar fire or being prey to burning shrapnel. The necessity to keep the Martinengo wall intact led defenders to strengthen other bastions, fearing the enemy would multiply impact zones. In the inner streets, civilians were requisitioned to carry water, reinforce barricades, and sometimes replace soldiers who had fallen in combat. Everyone felt the pressure mounting, while a pungent smell of gunpowder and smoke permeated the air. Church bells sounded alarms, doubling the anxiety from the bombardments. On this theater of operations, daily life remains challenging. Scenes of panic occurred during major mortar firings, forcing the population to run for cover. The alleys of Candia echo with prayers and cries, while the smell of burning persists at all hours. In this tense climate, the Cretan playwright Manolis Tzanis composes a farce called The Two Drums. Performed in front of the troops, it mocks the confusion that reigns at the sound of detonations. The characters bicker over who should beat the drum and set the rhythm of the ambient tension. Despite the apparent levity, the play reflects a painful truth. Everyone fears the next explosion may be fatal. The Ottoman soldiers, stationed in their trenches, sometimes hear these unexpected laughs, contrasting with the gravity of the situation. For a moment, local culture manages to transcend the anxiety of the siege, offering an escape for the exhausted fighters. Some chroniclers describe the play as a spark of hope amid the turmoil. Meanwhile, Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed continues his plan of massive bombardments. Convinced that modern artillery will bring him victory, he receives new pieces delivered from the Aegean Sea. The supply of gunpowder, musket balls, and large projectiles is maintained by a logistical network supported by neighboring provinces. Ottoman troops, galvanized by a few breaches already opened, concentrate their fire on specific points to provoke the final collapse of the defensive system. The Venetian High Command fears a general assault. The fall of Candia would break the balance in the eastern Mediterranean. Despite some naval successes, the Republic cannot entirely offset the impact of these Austrian-origin mortars, which have reversed the advantage of the Italian-style bastions. Inside the city, they organize mixed detachments, grouping soldiers and Greek militiamen, each trying to preserve what remains of the ramparts. The alarm bells ring often, punctuating the days and nights with incessant tension. The devastation caused by the bombs remains. The Ottoman supply of ammunition and provisions seems inexhaustible, while Venice struggles to keep pace. Attempts to negotiate a truce fail, with each side blaming the other for using cruel strategies. The Grand Vizier orders intensified fire at dawn, when the defenders are most vulnerable. The Venetians, entrenched in makeshift shelters, endure the constant pressure of petroleum bombs and large-caliber shells. Now, several bastions show alarming breaches, and the Martinengo rampart is nothing more than a heap of partially consolidated rubble. Officers fear that a simultaneous breach could occur at different points, rendering any counterattack impossible. In the city, fear grows. There are worries of famine, epidemics, or the sudden eruption of Turkish troops. The drums sound at night, sowing confusion among the enemy, but also among the exhausted civilians. Amid this chaos, some reports describe isolated acts of bravery, proof that the flame of resistance has not extinguished. Hope seems to be dwindling. As the year 1667 progresses, the crash of Austrian mortars and incendiary bombs does not abate. Ottoman engineers continuously perfect their firing platforms while the defenders repair their breaches at night. The most optimistic hope for external reinforcement, but most sense that the resistance is reaching its limits. Each cannon shot shakes the foundations of Candia a bit more, and the glassy breach, widened by large caliber projectiles, offers a grim prospect. The increasingly daring Ottoman sappers approach dangerously close to strategic points, evaluating the right moment to launch a massive assault. Between two explosions, the fleeting laughter sparked by the two drums reminds that Cretan culture has not yet given in. However, the disparity of forces and new generation artillery weigh heavily in the balance of the conflict. On the ramparts, everyone watches the horizon, fearing that the next shot will open the way for invasion. Supplies are running out, and time clearly seems to be on the Ottoman side. In 1667, as the long war of Candia between Venice and the Ottoman Empire had been dragging on for nearly 2 decades, the Republic of St. Mark decided to send a new commander to regain the initiative and boost the morale of its troops. The Venetian Senate, which sat in the Doge's palace in Venice, appointed Francesco Morosini as Capitano Generale da Mar, or Supreme Commander of the Serenissimi's naval forces. Coming from an illustrious patrician family, Morosini already had solid military experience and enjoyed a reputation for courage. His arrival at the helm of the fleet signaled a change in strategy and a determination to directly counter the Ottoman power in the Aegean Sea. Under Morosini's command, a squadron of 27 ships set sail from Venice in the spring of 1667. This considerable number of vessels included long galleys, heavier galleons, and several transport ships intended to carry supplies, ammunition, and additional soldiers. Upon arriving in the Aegean Sea, the new Capitano Generale quickly reinforced the defense of Venetian bases still held in the archipelago. The Italian, Dalmatian, and Greek garrisons, exhausted by repeated Ottoman assaults, thus received crucial support. Simultaneously, Morosini sent emissaries to various islands to secure the allegiance of local populations, often hesitant due to Venice's setbacks. This approach alleviated their concerns. Morosini's first significant action was organizing a bold offensive against the island of Chios, noted for its strategic position and resources. At the time, Chios was under Ottoman control, but the presence of a significant supply fleet destined to reinforce the troops besieging Candia piqued the Capitano Generale's interest. Determined to deal a severe blow to the enemy, Morosini coordinated a nocturnal raid on the island's main harbor. The convents, warehouses, and Ottoman arsenals were the targets of this operation, which proved devastating. The enemy transport ships, laden with provisions and ammunition for the Turkish army in Crete, were set ablaze. The enemy suffered significant losses. This success was not merely a result of heroism or luck. Morosini had methodically prepared this operation by relying on Greek spies and local fishermen, who knew the currents, secluded coves, and weaknesses of the Ottoman defenses. Some inhabitants of Chios, discontented with Turkish rule, provided valuable information on enemy positions. Although the Ottomans attempted to respond, the fire quickly spread to the ships, prompting the hasty withdrawal of nearby garrisons. The psychological impact was immense, as it demonstrated that the Venetian fleet could still strike at the heart of adverse supply lines even after so many years of war. Venice regained hope. Buoyed by this naval victory, Morosini then undertook a thorough reorganization of the military forces present in Crete and the surrounding islands. The Venetian troops, worn out by the numerous sieges and battles of recent years, needed more centralized command. Morosini thus created mixed companies, grouping Greek and Dalmatian soldiers under the same banner to improve internal cohesion. This measure bolstered solidarity among the different communities involved in the defense of Candia. Simultaneously, the Capitano Generale instituted disciplinary courts to manage deviant behavior, sanction desertions, and maintain the necessary order for proper military functioning. Officers applauded these initiatives. In this context, Morosini also sought to innovate technologically to give the Republic of Venice a decisive edge. It was thus that he introduced the use of strap bombs, sometimes considered true precursors of shrapnel shells. These were projectiles equipped with straps or metal reinforcements that, upon explosion, released shrapnel over a wider area. This artillery improvement provided the defenders of Candia with new options to counter Ottoman attacks. The gunners, trained in these new techniques, quickly endeavored to exploit the destructive power of these particular munitions, often surprising assailants accustomed to traditional cannons. This bolstered their determination. In the official report sent to the Senate, Morosini emphasized the effectiveness of these explosive devices and stressed the need to train more specialized artillerymen. For him, this modernization of weaponry was part of a larger framework, that of safeguarding Crete as the ultimate bulwark against the Ottoman advance in the eastern Mediterranean. Senior officers, aware of the crucial importance of this front, supported the project and allocated considerable financial resources to the production of sling bombs. New forges were set up near Venetian arsenals, both in Crete and in the Venetian lagoon, in order to quickly increase manufacturing capacity. Powder stocks increased significantly. Alongside his military activities, Morosini did not neglect the political and diplomatic dimension of his command. He maintained regular correspondence with the poet Arcangelo Tassoni, a Venetian literary figure with a strong influence in European intellectual circles. Tassoni composed texts extolling the courage of the defenders of Crete and praising the determination of the Republic in the face of the Ottoman Empire. These writings, distributed in certain courts of Italy and beyond, aimed to rally international public opinion in favor of Venice. Morosini saw this as a means to foster possible alliances, raise funds, or attract foreign volunteers to the conflict. This collaboration was particularly fruitful. Thanks to these literary channels and the careful staging of Venetian exploits, Morosini's image spread beyond the restricted circles of the Republic. In France, Spain, or the Dutch republics, people began to speak of this daring commander who defied the Ottoman navy. Pamphlets and poems circulated, recounting feats of arms sometimes exaggerated, but always conveying a clear message. Venice was fighting for the freedom of the Mediterranean. In return, foreign governments, though often preoccupied with their own conflicts, closely followed the Cretan resistance. Some merchants and adventurers, sensitive to this momentum, went to Crete to join the Venetian army. However, time was working against Morosini. The troops in Candia, still besieged by significant Ottoman forces, faced increasingly severe logistical difficulties. The contribution of new volunteers and weapons, though valuable, was not enough to completely reverse the balance on the ground. The Captain General Damar strove to disrupt enemy supply routes as much as possible, but the demographic power and mobilization capability of the Ottoman Empire remained formidable. Despite this, Morosini continued to believe that targeted naval actions, combined with effective propaganda, could break the Ottoman will, or at least gain the necessary respite for the survival of Venetian Crete. At the same time, Morosini's leadership of the fleet provoked strong reactions within the Venetian nobility. Some political rivals, envious of his growing popularity, plotted to diminish his influence. They accused him of personal ambition, insinuating that he sought to forge military glory to enhance his status. Yet the results spoke in his favor. Every raid against Ottoman positions, every crew member saved, and every enemy convoy diverted strengthened the legitimacy of the Captain General Damar. Morosini, aware of the political stakes, cautiously maintained his support in the Senate, ensuring to justify his decisions effectively. His prestige continued. The years 1667 and 1668 were thus marked by this permanent tension between military urgency, the search for external support, and internal rivalries in Venice. Morosini, despite his reputedly uncompromising nature, managed to exercise diplomacy with the Republic's key players. He produced detailed reports demonstrating the necessity of continuing the war effort in Crete to contain the Ottoman threat. At the same time, he encouraged collaboration with local populations, including those from distant regions like Dalmatia, whose contributions had often been overlooked. Thus, the Captain General sought to harmonize the entire Venetian apparatus to prepare for a new phase of the conflict. Time, however, was pressing. Morosini knew that demoralization threatened the men if no prospect of victory or relief was in sight. He redoubled efforts to improve the daily life of the soldiers, even visiting the field medical installations and ordering the creation of better-stocked canteens. The Captain General also encouraged religious practice as a cohesion factor. Chaplains now accompanied detachments on missions, offering spiritual and moral support. In the ports, processions were organized to call for divine protection over the fleet. Additionally, Morosini instituted rewards for those who showed initiative and exemplary courage during naval battles. These gestures consolidated collective determination. Furthermore, international political situations could still shift in Venice's favor. Morosini kept himself informed of the negotiations taking place in the main European courts. If France, under the influence of Mazarin and later Louis XIV, remained on the lookout for an opportunity to weaken the Ottoman Empire, it was still reluctant to engage deeply in an expensive conflict. The Dutch republics, focused on their commercial rivalries, hesitated to officially take sides. Spain, weakened by internal wars and the progressive loss of its hegemony, acted cautiously. Nevertheless, Morosini hoped that a symbolic victory, like the Chios affair, might encourage one of these states to intervene more directly. A massive support remained improbable. Within this interweaving of divergent interests, Francesco Morosini tirelessly pursued his mission, convinced that the future of Crete was determined as much on the seas as in the chancelleries. His successes, both naval and diplomatic, albeit often modest in face of the Ottoman threat, maintained a flame of hope among the defenders of Candia. The introduction of sling bombs, the reorganization of the Greco-Dalmatian companies, and the close ties with poet Arcangela Tassoni illustrated Venice's resolve to remain in the race, innovate, and win over international opinion. Few contemporaries would have bet on a quick resolution, yet all recognized the determined energy Morosini deployed day after day. Each battle, nevertheless, reinforced his reputation throughout Europe. At the beginning of summer 1669, Candia was already in a critical situation that seemed almost irreversible. After years of siege and countless assaults, the city walls, once considered a masterpiece of Venetian bastioned architecture, bore the scars of Ottoman bombardments everywhere. Inside, the civilian population and the garrisons of the Serene Republic saw their food supplies dangerously decrease, while the Venetian command, presided over by Francesco Morosini, continued to hope for the arrival of external reinforcements. It was finally at the very beginning of June that hope for the situation to shift in favor of the defenders took shape, thanks to the arrival in the harbor of Candia of a fleet dispatched by the French crown under the authority of the Duke of La Feuillade.
I have Robin and I'm listening to it too. So we'll talk later. Bye-bye.
This French officer, whose official title was Lieutenant General of the King's armies, disembarked with about 3,000 soldiers, some of whom constituted a contingent of disciplined regiments trained in modern military techniques. Their arrival galvanized the besieged, as La Feuillade had built a flattering reputation in France, and there was hope he would exercise a firm and effective command to support Morosini. However, from the first meetings, dissensions surfaced, as the Venetian Captain General de Mar absolutely insisted on retaining his strategic prerogatives, while the French considered themselves superior in military prestige. Moreover, La Feuillade had the diplomatic support of Cardinal Mazarin, Louis XIV's principal minister, who viewed the defense of Candia as a means to strengthen the Franco-Venetian alliance in the Mediterranean. Morosini was aware of these stakes and knew that this foreign aid was essential to him. However, the characteristic pride of high-ranking officers gave rise to quarrels over etiquette and precedence, with each side seeking to highlight their experience. Tensions came to a head during protracted war councils, where supporters of a bold counteroffensive clashed with those advocating caution, conscious of the fact that the Ottomans remained significantly superior in number. While the French and Venetians were trying to overcome their differences, the Ottoman army continued to rigorously encircle Candia. The troops of the Grand Vizier Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed, backed by engineers experienced in the art of siege warfare, which encompasses all siege techniques, had already dug multiple trenches converging toward the most exposed bastions of the fortress. The entire northwestern zone, where the Sabbionera Bastion and Vituri Bastion were located, was subjected to heavy fire, while the southeastern front, near the Boatyard Bastion, suffered considerable damage from large-caliber cannonballs. The half-moons erected by the Venetians to reinforce certain vulnerable angles were already showing signs of collapse, exposing the main enclosure to imminent danger. During the month of July, a new offensive phase was put in place. The Ottomans decided to attempt a simultaneous triple assault in order to catch the defenders off guard. On the night of July 24 to 25, 1669, the Turkish infantry launched against the Sabbionera, Vituri, and Boatyard bastions almost simultaneously. This combined tactic aimed to disperse the Venetian and French forces, forcing Morosini and La Feuillade to divide their artillery and reserve reinforcements. The fighting was fierce. There were reports of deadly hand-to-hand combat on top of the walls, where arquebusiers and pikemen hidden behind damaged parapets tried to repel successive waves of Ottoman fighters. In some places, Turkish soldiers managed to dig holes in the outer wall, causing occasional panics among the defenders. However, the careful coordination put in place by the Venetian and French officers allowed this offensive to be contained temporarily, despite already heavy human losses. The Ottomans did not cease their pressure after this first wave. As the smoke from the cannons and dust from the debris settled, the Ottoman artillery resumed intensive fire, aiming to create an irreparable failure in the defense. At the same time, it was reported that Ottoman sappers continued their mining work, trying to collapse an entire segment of the rampart near the Saint-André Bastion, a vital strategic point for the defense of Candia. On July 25th, as the second wave of the Ottoman assault struck the Sabbionera and Vituri bastions again, the situation suddenly shifted on the Saint-André bastion front. A violently powerful explosion shook the entire defensive setup. According to some chronicles, it would have been a powder magazine hidden in the undergrounds that was hit by the Ottoman galleries and exploded, killing more than 600 defenders instantly. The shockwave caused by this explosion spread throughout the sector, making the neighboring walls waver and hurling debris tens of meters away. The survivors, stunned, had to face a new Turkish assault that took advantage of the confusion. Morosini, present in an advanced command post, urgently sent all available reinforcements to try to seal the gaping breach that had just opened. La Feuillade also hurriedly intervened with his French companies, multiplying encouragements to his men to hold the position. Despite previous differences, the two leaders cooperated in the urgency to prevent the total collapse of the Saint-André bastion. At the cost of superhuman determination, the defense line was temporarily saved, but everyone inside Candia understood that the fortress would not withstand such a large-scale offensive for much longer. Despite the courage displayed by the Christian troops, the defenders' morale was considerably affected by the extent of the destruction and the sudden death of hundreds of experienced soldiers. In the streets of Candia, scenes of desolation occurred every day. Wounded crowded into makeshift hospitals, civilians searching for food, artisans urgently asked to repair every remaining piece of fortifications still standing. Venetian and French officers had to manage both the military logistics and the declining morale of the population. Tensions between Morosini and La Feuillade remained palpable, although the necessity of a common defense forced them to collaborate on the ground. Behind the ramparts, high-level meetings orchestrated by the War Council followed one another, each party trying to assert their strategy to save the city. In early August, the situation worsened further when observers reported that additional Ottoman reinforcements were arriving from the mainland, bringing new artillery pieces and a contingent of light cavalry. At the same time, the already fragile Venetian maritime communications were disrupted by the threat of enemy galleys stationed near the Cretan coast. Supply convoys sent from the Ionian Islands or Italy were becoming increasingly rare, worsening the shortage inside the fortress. Complaints arose among the French soldiers, who felt they lacked enough munitions and provisions to withstand a prolonged siege. The Venetians, for their part, saw their lines of defense eroding a bit more each day. Faced with these overwhelming realities, the Venetian High Command issued a series of orders instructing the officers on site to study the conditions for a possible capitulation. Morosini, although known for his obstinacy and reputation as a tenacious strategist, gradually resigned himself to the idea that a peaceful outcome should be considered. Among the French ranks, La Feuillade feared seeing the honor of his troops dissipate in vain, but the reality on the ground was relentless. The explosions suffered at the Sabbionera and Saint-André bastions had severely damaged the fortifications, and the loss of several hundred qualified defenders had dramatically reduced resistance capabilities. The civilian population feared an ultimate massacre and implored that an agreement be reached. Negotiations truly began only at the end of August, when intermediaries appointed by Morosini and Koprulu Fazl Ahmed met in a neutral zone near the trench lines. This exchange allowed for the establishment of the main points of a potential agreement. However, it took several more days of debates held in a tense environment, and the Venetian High Command feared that the conditions imposed by the Ottomans would be too humiliating. The Ottoman representatives, for their part, wanted to demonstrate the superiority of the Sublime Porte while avoiding a massacre that could have compromised the future stability of Crete. As La Feuillade published letters to Louis XIV, Morosini distanced himself from this diplomacy to preserve the Venetian privilege in any final negotiation. On September 6, 1669, after final altercations, an emergency council of war validated the capitulation of Candia. The clauses established in the final act first provided for the honorable evacuation of 3,600 Venetians, including both the remaining soldiers and administrators and families of notable figures. The Ottomans committed to respecting the free exercise of the Orthodox faith, an essential measure for the local Greek population, as well as the safekeeping of the sacred relics of St. Titus, considered a priceless treasure for the faithful. This provision, obtained after long discussions, aimed to allay the fears of the Orthodox Greeks who dreaded a policy of religious repression. The Ottoman negotiators also agreed to allow enough time for the Venetian troops to calmly embark on ships of the Serenissima without fearing a last-minute attack. Among the participants in this decisive council, it is reported that Morosini, with a grave expression, signed the documents with his firm handwriting, while La Feuillade deliberately kept silent, aware that France had nothing more to gain from this matter. The evacuation was organized immediately, mobilizing several vessels to transport not only armed men but also Venetian archives, some cannons deemed recoverable, and various valuable items accumulated over the decades. In the days that followed, a sad procession of galleys and merchant ships was seen heading west, all loaded with the few possessions the Venetians could still salvage. Behind them stretched a now silent, wounded city. From 1670 onwards, the Republic of Venice found itself in a delicate position, but not entirely devoid of resources. Despite the loss of Candia, present-day Heraklion, and most of Crete, it managed to retain several strategic fortresses along the island's coastline. Among these key positions were Spinalonga, a fortified islet situated on the northeastern coast of Crete; Ceuta, a stronghold advantageously located in the bay of the same name near Chania; and Grambusa, a rocky islet in the northwest. These three posts, isolated but robustly equipped with artillery, served as important outposts to maintain a Venetian presence and continued to operate as advanced ramparts of the Republic in this part of the Mediterranean. Although the geopolitical significance of these reduced holdings was less than when Venice controlled all of Candia, they extended the military and maritime influence of the Serenissima in the region. The Venetian governors sent to these sites, often from mainland Venetian nobility, or more rarely, from the patrician families of the lagoon city, strove to keep them in an acceptable state of defense. The fortifications were regularly repaired and modernized to withstand any potential attacks. The years following the fall of Candia were marked by efforts to strengthen bastioned bulwarks in the Italian style, inspired by the methods of engineer Michel Sanmicheli, who had already redesigned many of Crete's defenses in the 16th century. This presence on Spinalonga, Ceuta, and Grambusa, although symbolic of a certain Venetian tenacity, was not only of a military nature. It also addressed an economic and strategic need. Venice sought to maintain forward bases capable of hosting privateers allied with the Republic. At that time, and until 1715, these fortified islands became safe havens for captains of privateer ships. The corsairs, under contract or holding Venetian letters of marque, conducted harassment operations against Ottoman vessels or merchant ships suspected of supplying the Ottoman Empire, sometimes attacking the commerce of other rival powers if the opportunity arose. Venice had long known how to exploit piracy or privateering to destabilize its opponents and extend its influence, particularly in the eastern Mediterranean. The garrisons on site also provided logistical support, repairing damaged ships, caring for wounded men, storing ammunition, and even receiving strategic information collected during boardings. thus keeping the Republic informed of movements in the Aegean Sea or the Straits of the Ottoman Empire. Simultaneously, the colossal war effort that Venice had committed to for over 2 decades had major financial repercussions on its entire economy. The long defense of Candia, officially begun in 1648, but already initiated by the dispatch of troops and resources from 1645 onwards, consumed considerable sums. According to figures released by the Venetian economic magistracies in the 1670s, the public debt of the Serenissima doubled over the course of the conflict, rising from approximately 14 million ducats to over 28 million. Creditors, drawn from both the high Venetian nobility and wealthy merchants in other Italian cities, financed the war by subscribing to state bonds or interest-bearing securities. The rates offered by Venice, higher than in normal times, added a long-term burden for the Republic. Taxes, already relatively heavy in the territories of the terra firma, namely the Venetian possessions on the mainland, primarily in eastern Lombardy and Veneto, were increased for all subjects, causing significant discontent. The Venetian authorities imposed an array of additional taxes on salt, wheat, silk, and commercial transactions transiting through the Adriatic ports. Tensions arose, particularly in the regions of Bergamo and Brescia, where some artisans and merchants complained about being unable to cope with the charges imposed by the government of the Republic. For several years, Venice found itself forced to borrow even more to repay previous creditors. This cycle of indebtedness compelled it to cut back on other investments, such as the maintenance of certain official palaces, and slowed its shipyard activities at the arsenal, where the construction of galleys and ships of the line experienced a notable slowdown in the 1670s. In the meantime, the Ottoman Empire, winner of the War of Candia, takes advantage of its victory to confirm its maritime supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. While Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, remains the administrative and political capital of the empire, the Sublime Porte decides, prompted by influential viziers, to gradually shift the naval center of gravity towards Izmir, known in the west as Smyrna. This port city, located on the western coast of Anatolia, experiences rapid development in the 17th century thanks to its growing role in international trade. Significant commercial traffic between Europe, Asia, and the Near East transits through it, including spices, silk, and Levantine products. Shipyards, previously concentrated on the Golden Horn and in a few scattered arsenals, are modernized in Izmir with the input of Ottoman technicians and engineers, trained in the latest artillery and naval construction techniques. The aim of the sultans and the grand viziers, with the Köprülü faction remaining influential until the late 1670s, is to be able to react more quickly to potential threats from Christian states or incursions by corsairs based in Crete or other Aegean islands. By transferring part of the fleet and military installations, the empire partially frees itself from the constraint of the long transit from Istanbul and gains flexibility. This strategic maneuver, becoming increasingly visible from 1670 onward, is accompanied by the reinforcement of numerous garrisons in the Aegean Sea islands to prevent any Venetian raid attempts similar to those launched during the Siege of Candia. Following the upheavals caused by the loss of most of Crete, the island witnesses massive population movements. The Cretans who, during the war, had supported the Serenissima, notably the Greek Orthodox archons who remained loyal to Venice or feared for their future under the Ottoman regime, leave Crete to rebuild their lives elsewhere. The Cyclades, under Venetian domination or the influence of various Italian families, become a favored destination for many Greek notables and ecclesiastics. They hope to find a certain degree of religious freedom there, even though these islands will remain uncertain zones for a long time, coveted by different pirates or corsairs. The wealthiest families also settle in the main cities of the Republic, such as Venice itself, Cattaro on the Dalmatian coast, or in the south of the Italian peninsula. In Naples, Bari, and Calabria, the settlement of Cretan refugees gives new impetus to local Orthodox communities. Small groups even head to Sicily, seeking the protection of powerful Spanish lords associated with the Habsburg monarchy. Thus, as early as the first years of the 1670s, an upsurge in Cretan immigration is recorded, contributing to the spread of post-Byzantine iconography throughout the Mediterranean. Icon painters, trained in the Greek tradition but also influenced by Venetian culture, serve local patrons, creating religious works that preserve the codes of Byzantine art while gradually incorporating elements of the Italian Renaissance. For example, these icons feature more pronounced use of perspective or new standards for representing faces, signs of the artistic blending born from several centuries of Venetian presence in Crete. Cretan workshops in Corfu or Zante, Zakynthos flourish, and the learning of these techniques continues through the diasporas settling in Italy, who pass on an ancestral know-how enriched with Western influences to their descendants. As Cretan society adapts to this new reality, whether living under Ottoman rule or in exile, the first historical accounts begin to emerge, direct or indirect witnesses of the long war that has just ended. On the Venetian side, a certain N. Soranzo, a magistrate who held administrative functions during the conflict or in the immediate period following it, undertakes to write a chronicle where he recounts, in a structured manner, the heroic resistance of Candia, the supply difficulties, and the diplomatic negotiations that marked these years of combat. His work, not devoid of a certain Venetian chauvinism, nevertheless relies on official archives, as well as testimonies from survivors and soldiers who served in the garrison. Published in Venice, his account arouses keen interest among patricians who are still proud of their city's maritime heritage. Soranzo meticulously details the plans of the bastions, the names of the Italian engineers, and the various political compromises which sometimes delayed the arrival of potential allies, such as France or Spain. Although written with a view to rehabilitating the Venetian effort, his writings quickly become a reference source for European scholars of the time who seek to understand the complexity of the war between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. On the other side, in the Ottoman Empire, the pen of Evliya Çelebi, a traveler and writer born in Istanbul, also bears witness to the phase of Ottoman conquest over Crete and the first years following the pacification of the island. Known for his long journeys throughout the empire and beyond its borders, Evliya Çelebi takes a curious and detailed look at the regions he traverses. His accounts, grouped in a monumental work often called the Seyahatname or Book of Travels, include numerous anecdotes about local customs, city architecture, and even the multiplicity of peoples encountered. Regarding Crete, Çelebi's Turkish account, written during the 1670s, describes not only the state of the fortifications, sometimes damaged by the long siege, but also the attitude of the inhabitants, who, according to him, were torn between loyalty to Venice, fear of new atrocities, and the temptation to accommodate an Ottoman regime that offered certain religious freedoms. While he notes the harshness of Ottoman domination towards rebels, he also emphasizes the efforts of the Turkish administration to restore commercial exchanges and encourage the cultivation of olives, vineyards, as well as the importation of products from Anatolia. The combined reading of the works of Soranzo and Çelebi presents invaluable value for modern historians, as it offers two distinct perspectives on a major conflict that reshaped the geopolitics of the Eastern Mediterranean. The cultural impact of this post-siege period is also felt in the slow reconfiguration of the identity of Ottoman Crete. The new authorities strive to integrate the population while granting a certain autonomy to the Orthodox communities in order to maintain peace and profit from the island's resources. Greek Orthodox priests and monks retain the right to celebrate their liturgies, although the Patriarchate of Constantinople must now intervene to set the limits of ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Specific taxes, such as the capitation tax on non-Muslims, weigh on the local Greek populations, but former privileged groups, notably some wealthy families who negotiated their allegiance with the Ottomans, obtained partial exemptions. At the same time, Turkish settlers, often of Anatolian origin, settle on Cretan lands, sometimes receiving plots confiscated from the Venetians or their supporters. This reconfiguration of land ownership leads to new power dynamics in the countryside, redefining the social hierarchies that had formed under Venetian administration. During these 13 years, from 1670 to 1683, Venice attempted to restore some of its maritime power. However, the Republic's coffers were depleted, the debt had doubled, and the occasional subsidies obtained from certain Catholic powers, such as the Pope or Spain, proved insufficient to cover the expenses incurred. In the Adriatic, it maintained a de facto superiority thanks to a network of galleys and lighter ships, but the construction of large vessels became rarer. The few projects launched at the arsenal focused on maintaining and modernizing the existing fleet, seeking to enhance firepower by integrating more precise and maneuverable cannons, inspired by techniques found among the Dutch or the English, even though the latter had begun a different type of naval rivalry since the Parliamentary Revolution. Venetian maritime engineers, keen to maintain a certain prestige, retained the tradition of galleys, even though they no longer represented the future of naval warfare, as sail ships capable of long open sea campaigns were gradually taking over in Western Europe. Moreover, commercial routes suffered from growing competition from Atlantic ports like Lisbon or London, depriving Venice of part of the income derived from the transit of spices and luxury goods from the east. The territories still under Venetian control, namely some areas of the Ionian Sea, including Corfu, Zakynthos, Kythera, as well as the three fortresses of Crete, retained a certain vitality. On the Ionian Islands, the Orthodox population coexisted with Latin administrators, a model inherited from the feudal past, established after the Fourth Crusade of 1204. The local trade, based on olive oil, wine, and citrus production, maintained regular flows with the Italian peninsula. The sailors, accustomed to short but frequent crossings, remained loyal to Venice as long as it ensured protection against North African corsairs and Ottoman ships. The fortresses of Spinalonga and Ceuta provided cover for the rare convoys that Venice could still send in the eastern Mediterranean. The corsairs, often Maltese or Catalan, used these support points as bases of retreat, which only fueled Ottoman mistrust and indirectly contributed to the increase of the Turkish fleet stationed in Izmir to prevent any infiltration or aggression. In the cultural and religious domain, exchanges remained, however, more intense than one might initially believe. Although Venice and the Ottoman Empire continually were rivals, some Greek or Jewish merchants continued shuttling between the Aegean archipelago and the European continent. Books, including those recounting the events of the Siege of Candia, circulated from hand to hand. The writings of Soranzo, printed in Venice for a patrician readership, sometimes reached Ottoman lands via Francophone or Italian merchants established in Smyrna or Constantinople. In the Ottoman camp, while the work of Evliya Çelebi was initially known in manuscript form, his fame spread orally among the learned circles. Western diplomats or travelers who met him or heard about him would later report, upon their return, the story of this curious scholar. Over the years, the Western view of Ottoman domination in Crete began to become more nuanced, not merely confined to the vision of the constant threat. and some chanceries became aware of the diversity of the populations under the Sultan's power and the means employed to win their loyalty. On a more general level, the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean remains very tense. In the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire is also conducting other military campaigns, notably against local princes, or to further weaken the power of the Habsburgs. The successes gained in Crete allow the Sublime Porte to strengthen its authority over the Aegean and to potentially threaten other Venetian or Christian possessions in the region in the long term. The Venetians retain the memory of stubborn resistance and an interminable siege, but they know that their room for maneuver remains limited. Venetian diplomatic agents cautiously attempt to maintain ties at the Ottoman court, which is itself focused on projects of conquest in Central Europe or on internal rivalries. The palace factions, from Köprülü Mehmed to his successors, strive to strengthen the cohesion of the Ottoman state and ensure that newly acquired or conquered territories result in tangible benefits for the administration. Enlistment of new recruits into the army, increased tax revenues, more direct control of maritime routes. Thus, the desire to build a powerful naval hub in Izmir symbolizes this quest for centralization and military modernization. In this context, propaganda also plays a role. Official historians from both camps, paid by their political patrons, publish accounts and testimonies that justify the policies pursued. On the Venetian side, the emphasis is on heroism, piety, and the pain of sacrifice. On the Ottoman side, the focus is on the righteousness of a war waged to punish Venetian aggressions at sea or to bring tranquility to a historically turbulent region. Writers and chroniclers often refer to feats of arms or anecdotes that capture the public's imagination. Venetian relics, including those of St. Titus, once brought back from Crete, become the subject of religious ceremonies in Venice, reminding people of the heartache caused by the loss of the island. Within the Ottoman Empire itself, official sermons in mosques celebrate the Sultan's regained power, whose Mediterranean territory has not been so vast since the conquests of Suleiman Nurfars in 1520. Towards the end of the period 1670-1683, a new issue begins to arise in the struggle for influence in Central Europe, where the Habsburgs' Austria and the Ottoman Empire clash more pronouncedly, culminating in 1683 with the famous Siege of Vienna. This rise in tension to the east and north of the empire relegates the Eastern Mediterranean somewhat to a secondary concern for the Ottomans. The garrisons left behind, particularly in Crete, must continue to manage the local populations and leverage the island's resources. For Venice, the possibility of a new war with the Ottoman Empire is never entirely dismissed. The diplomats of the Serenissima carefully observe the balance of power, counting on a possible European coalition if another confrontation should escalate into a naval or land force struggle in Greece or Albania. However, the immediate post-war period in Candia focuses mainly on stabilizing the region and rebuilding, on the Venetian side, a fleet and an army worthy of the name, despite the burden of colossal debt. Cretan migrations remained significant throughout the 1670s and early 1680s. Farmers, who often suffered the direct destruction of their fields and villages, leave in search of regions less subjected to military pressures. Many among them join families established in other Greek islands that escape the Ottoman yoke or live under a more autonomous regime. Young monks and priests frequently head to monasteries in the Peloponnese or the Cyclades, seeking to continue their religious practices. Others set out for the mainland, going to Epirus or Thessaly, where long-established Ottomans are accustomed to welcoming new populations. In this human mixing, post-Byzantine iconography Greek religious music, and Cretan culinary traditions, like certain preparations with wild herbs and olive oil, spread throughout the region and even beyond. While some artists choose to continue their craft in the major urban workshops of the Italian peninsula, others prefer to remain in new places of refuge, benefiting from the relative cultural tolerance that sets in. The iconostases of metropolitan churches, notably in the Cyclades, are thus adorned with panels derived from the so-called Cretan Venetian tradition, a style blending Orthodox heritage and Western reminiscences. During this period, it is clear that Crete remains a central point in the collective memory and imagination of the Mediterranean. The Venetians hold on to the more or less realistic idea that they could one day retake the island thanks to a favorable conjunction of alliances. The Ottomans, on the other hand, consider Crete as definitively integrated into the imperial fold, a key piece in their control of the maritime route to Egypt and the Levant. Diplomatic exchanges allow some hope of compromises to filter through. European merchants, whether French, English, Dutch, or Genoese, continue to negotiate with Ottoman authorities for access to Cretan stops. Tensions are not always uninterrupted, with tacit truces established when commercial profit proves mutually beneficial. However, the ransoms paid to corsairs, the rackets carried out on this or that ship, and the internal rivalries within the Ottoman Empire itself mean that peace in the eastern Mediterranean remains fragile. Venice jealously monitors its 3 island outposts, fearing that a potential rebellion of the garrison or a plot coming from Constantinople might snatch these last remnants of its former glory.
Make it right in the next life.
It is in this contrasting climate that many chronicles, travelers' tales, and diplomatic letters are written, aiming to describe the situation following the Great Siege. The Chronicle of N. Soranzo is read in Venetian salons, sometimes updated when a particular ambassador seeks to persuade a European ally of the justness of the Venetian cause in the East. It features logistical details, notes on military engineering, but also patriotic outbursts celebrating the defender's sacrifice. In the Ottoman world, the account of Evliya Çelebi is enriched as he travels. He reports the words of Turkish officers on the situation in Crete, compares the state of roads and markets, and mentions the fate of Greek families under Muslim governance. This exchange of information, although indirect, contributes to a better mutual understanding between the two shores of the Mediterranean, even in a context still marked by rivalry. The year 1683 marks a turning point when the Ottoman Empire launches the monumental offensive that will lead it to the gates of Vienna, mobilizing a large part of its land and naval forces, and temporarily diverting attention from Crete, the Aegean, and the southern front. The Venetians, informed by their diplomatic networks, consider exploiting the potential Ottoman weakness on the Cretan shores, while preparing for other geopolitical configurations. However, even before new plans for reconquest emerge at the court of Venice, the enormous debt and the weariness of the population weigh heavily. The merchant elites often prefer to rely on fruitful exchanges with the Ottoman Empire when it comes to selling fabrics and spices, rather than engaging in costly expeditions. The main competitors of the Serenissima, such as the Netherlands or England, are more interested in the Atlantic and the East Indies, leaving Venice with only a small portion of a Mediterranean trade, less dynamic than in the 16th century. The Cretan emigrants, for their part, try to adapt to the societies that have welcomed them, sometimes preserving their language and certain rights, while assimilating elements of local cultures. Thus, during the last quarter of the 17th century, Crete remains at the heart of scattered intellectual and religious networks, linking Greek monasteries of the Peloponnese, icon workshops on the Ionian Islands, and Orthodox fraternities in Venice or Naples, bearing witness to a living heritage despite political vicissitudes.